history, we do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the red. 10-point drop on the S&P right now, down 0.2%. Rally in stocks faded as heightened political risk in France drove the premium on the nation's 10-year bonds toward the widest since 2017 over safer German peers. S&P down 12 now, 54.08, retreating from yesterday's record, down 0.2%. NASDAQ now in the red since our last update, down 15 points, drop there of 0.1%. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average down 278, a decline of 0.7%. 10-year 4.24%, with the 2-year 4.67%. Gold down 1.3%, 22.97 the ounce, back below 2,300. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.1%, 78.39 a barrel. We've got Tesla shares advancing right now, up by 4.2%, after Elon Musk said shareholders voted by wide margins in favor of reapproving his compensation package and moving the company's state of incorporation to Texas. And Ford will sell its lineup of electric vehicles through all 2,800 of its U.S. dealers in a bid to boost sales of battery-powered models now being shunned by mainstream buyers. Ford lowered today by 1%. Recapping stocks in the red, S&P down 13, drop there of 0.2%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie, we thank you. Welcome to the Thursday edition of Balance of Power. It's Little Friday. It's 100 degrees or something in Washington this afternoon. It's a good day to take Metro, says Mike Dorning, because the street closures will be enough to point you in that direction. Donald Trump shuttling around Capitol Hill. He's down in the wharf area right now as we connected with Kaylee Lyons from the Business Roundtable. That's where the former president is as we speak, talking to a room full of about 90 CEOs and some pretty bold-faced names. Jamie Dimon, Tim Cook, both in the room. We'll see if Kaylee can have a conversation with any of them on the way out here. So far, the former president has been not really seen in public, but meeting with lawmakers, meeting with leaders on Capitol Hill, and now corporate leaders. And we should know the Business Roundtable event is not a Trump event. This is a normal part of the campaign cycle in which representatives from both campaigns speak to the CEOs. Joe Biden's in Italy for the G7, and so he sent his chief of staff to speak on his behalf. That took place earlier than Donald Trump speaking right now to the Business Roundtable. Mike Dorning's got his eyes on all this. He's not on Metro. He's actually here in the studio in the safe confines of the Bloomberg Bureau. It's good to see you.
Great to be here.
This is kind of a moment after January 6th,
the
big return. This isn't really about policy, though, right? This is, I'm back.
It's about unity. It's about getting all the Republicans behind him.
What does it tell you that Mitch McConnell shows up for this?
Well, Mitch McConnell, since the beginning of the year, even though he's had big differences with Donald Trump, particularly over the January 6th attack, wants a Republican victory in November. He wants to push through Republican policies. And in particular, he wants Trump to be behind the Senate candidates and the congressional candidates as well. And so here you have the whole party unifying, and that's really important for the congressional candidates too, even the ones in swing districts, because they need enthusiasm from the base.
I'm guessing they're not talking about their wives. Is Mitch McConnell holding his nose here? Or?
I think he's Mitch McConnell is like Mr. Pragmatist. Right? He's always been a political pragmatist, and he, understands politics, understands the calculation, understands there's no benefit for his goal of having a Republican take over the Senate, to have differences between the Senate and the Republican nominee.
Interesting moment for the Republican conference. They held the Attorney General in contempt of Congress with a vote that they could show the former president today. They gave him the game ball from the Republican-won congressional baseball game last night. Quite the stage setter before we even got the SCOTUS ruling today for Donald Trump to be back. This Merrick Garland vote, they didn't know if it was actually going to pass. It did.
They whipped it very hard.
They whipped it pretty hard. Does it matter?
It probably doesn't matter that much for the general public, and certainly this is going nowhere. But it is an effort to kind of muddy the water on Trump's criminal conviction.
Because they didn't provide the audio recordings of Joe Biden's interview with
that's
special counsel.
that's the actual
Did this set a precedent, though, as some Democrats say, a dangerous precedent?
Democrats also tried to hold the Trump's attorney general in contempt of Congress. And, that Justice Department declined to prosecute it. You might well imagine this Justice Department not prosecuting this. I mean, arguably, had they gone along with this, and it could have created a precedent. But really what this is just using every tool at the House's disposal to try to put some cover fire for Trump on his criminal cases.
Got it. Mike Dorning, great to see you, as always. Funny day in Washington. Maybe I'll bump into you on the Metro. Always a pleasure to have Mike Dorning with us, helping to report and edit our political coverage here in Washington every day. I'm Joe Matthew in the nation's capital, where we're keeping an eye on a couple of different things. As we mentioned, the split screen today. Donald Trump will emerge from this meeting at some point here with the CEO. He's going to hold a news conference. That's scheduled for an hour from now. 15 minutes later, the President of the United States is expected to be holding forth from Italy at the G7 in a bilateral news conference that he's going to hold with Volodymyr Zelensky. And they have something to announce today with a new agreement that we're going to spend some time talking to Courtney McBride about here, because this is the moment, these are the moments that the incumbent enjoys, right? And he's got some real work to do, of course, with the potential for a ceasefire in Israel to come from this, not to mention progress in Ukraine. Courtney McBride is Bloomberg's national security reporter, frequently on the plane at events like these, and we're lucky to have her today in Washington, D.C. You're watching this from across the ocean. Just like everyone in Washington here with Donald Trump, the split screen is really incredible. So give us your sense of what Joe Biden wants to accomplish in this news conference today, because he's going to be hearing from domestic and foreign reporters.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
The big thing today certainly is Ukraine. We have a report out that the G7 leaders have agreed on a plan. It's still somewhat vague, but for a loan syndicate that is going to allow them to tap Russian reserves, frozen currency to repay loans issued by the U.S., the EU, and other G7 countries to support Ukraine's defense against Russia. So I think that's, Zelensky, as you said, is in Italy. He's meeting with President Biden, and those are the types of things that I think they're going to want to emphasize today, that the West is staying firm in support of Ukraine. The
seizing of Russian assets is something we're hearing a lot about, knowing that they passed the Repo Act on Capitol Hill months ago, I guess at this point, weeks at least ago, when the Ukrainian funding was passed. President signed that into law. But clearly it's not as simple as that, with the bulk of this money locked up in Europe. And I'm hearing that legal challenges would make this a years-long project. Is that the reality?
So, I mean, I think the workaround that they seem to have landed upon after months of wrangling is to use the profits, the interest essentially on those assets, as a loan guarantee for the countries. So the individual countries are going to issue loans to Ukraine and assume the risk that those Russian assets, roughly $280 billion, most of which, as you said, are held outside the U.S., held in Europe, to back those loans.
What do you make of the guest list at this G7? Obviously, Vladimir Putin's not walking around. I don't think China's invited, right? Maybe you can explain that to me. But you've got Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. You've got the Pope. Is this a new look for the G7?
Well, I mean, the G7 host is always welcome to add additional guests. President Zelensky has certainly been making the rounds and making his case around the world wherever he can. We saw him in Davos. We've seen him at the United Nations. Possibly he could come to the NATO summit. So all of those venues make sense for him as he continues to plead his case and appeal to the West to remain with Ukraine and supportive of it.
If Courtney McBride is at this G7, where's your focus? Is it the sideline meetings that are taking place when the press corps might not be around? Is it the contents of the communique? Folks who are with us right now on YouTube are looking literally at the photo opportunity. There are a lot of different elements of a G7 that make this important. Where's the news for you?
Certainly. I mean, I think those bilateral meetings can be really critical ways for the leaders to try to iron out areas of difference among the partners. One may try to lean on another and just make sure that that joint communique does reflect a real unanimity.
Because sometimes 6 months later, you hear about something that developed in a meeting like that. Guess who? They were in the same room. You might not have even known about it. Is spontaneity part of this for the administration to try to let nature take its course on some of these issues?
Certainly possible. Obviously, for the host, you probably want a very tightly choreographed event. But they have to seize opportunities where they can to build consensus, perhaps to secure agreement on things that might have been at issue. I mean, as we discussed, this frozen assets plan has been in the works for months and months, and some countries may have been a little bit more gung-ho than others. But the legal precedent that it could establish is a real concern for folks both in the U.S. government and in partner governments.
When will we have takeaways? By the end of the day tomorrow, you'll have a sense of whether this was productive, successful for Joe Biden? I
think by then we will have a sense of that. But for something like this plan, the proof will be in the pudding. It could take months to iron out the details, but the goal is for Ukraine to have some of these funds in hand by the end of the year. The goal is $50 billion in aggregate in loans from the U.S. and other partner countries.
Great. We bring you to the source on this program, and the source today is Courtney McBride. Love having you on. Thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
As always, Bloomberg's national security reporter bringing us inside our coverage here as we wait to hear from Joe Biden. About an hour from now, you'll hear and see him here on Bloomberg Radio and on YouTube. I'm Joe Matthew. We turn to world and national news before we assemble our panel. For that, we turn to Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom here in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. The Supreme Court has ruled to uphold full access to the abortion pill mifepristone. Bloomberg's Amy Mars has more from Washington.
The justices preserved full access to a widely used abortion pill in a case that carries major stakes for reproductive rights and election year politics. The court unanimously overturned a federal appeals ruling that would have barred mail-order prescriptions for mifepristone, the drug now used in more than half of U.S. abortions. The lower court ruling would have reduced abortion access even in states where reproductive rights have broad support. The majority on the court said the anti-abortion doctors and organizations that sued lacked legal standing because they're not directly affected by the FDA's actions. In Washington, Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. Coming up, the U.S. Open Golf Update brought to you by Audi. Don't let anyone else drive off in the Audi model you've always wanted. Visit your local Audi dealer to get behind the wheel of yours today. I'm Nancy Lyons.
6:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks now lower across the board. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the red one day after yesterday's Fed decision. A rally in stocks faded amid heightened political risk in France. The S&P right now down 10 points, retreating from yesterday's record, down 0.2%. Dow Industrials lower by 0.6%. The Dow down 238 points. While NASDAQ is little change, down less than 0.1%. The NASDAQ 100 index, full of big tech names, though, advancing 0.2%. 10-year 4.25%, with a 2-year 4.68%. Gold down 1.2%, $22.98 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude up just about 0.1%, $78.56 a barrel. A day after the Fed meeting, stocks lower across the board. Weekly jobs are up. Weekly jobless claims are up, topping estimates as we hear from Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
We're looking at the highest level in 9 months. 242,000 new jobless claims last week, with California accounting for the most. Claims have been running at historic lows, some of the lowest in decades. Now, though, the unemployment rate is up 4% as of May, mostly a reflection of people returning to the workforce and not finding jobs. Actual job cuts, however, have by and large remained subdued on a national level. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
After earnings, Broadcom up now by 12.1%. After the close of trading today, we will be hearing from Adobe. Adobe up by 0.1%. Recapping stocks lower, S&P now down 0.2%. Balance of power continues right now. Back we go to Washington, and once again your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Charlie Pellet. Great to see you. You can always see Charlie Pellet if you're with us on YouTube. Go there, search Bloomberg Global News. You'll find our live stream. And you can hang out with us in our studios here in Washington and in New York as we bring in some of the best minds in the business to talk politics and business each day. They collide today in Washington as Donald Trump and the chief of staff at the White House separately brief the Business Roundtable. There's quite a collection of 90 CEOs here. Think Tim Scott, Jamie Dimon in the same room, listening to policy proposals as they try to get their heads around them, maybe even have an opportunity to affect those policy proposals and the agendas from the two front runners here, the incumbent and the Republican presumed nominee. We assemble our panel with more to talk about here, and we've got some polling to throw in as we're going to be hearing from both Donald Trump and Joe Biden about an hour from now. Trump in Washington, where he's back. Joe Biden in Italy at the G7. And it looks like we're going to have competing news conferences here. I don't know if they're watching each other or how this is going to work out. The choreography could be interesting. Maybe one waits for the other. Maybe one tries to interrupt the other. They're going to force likely a split screen right here and on visual media across the world today. The world is literally watching. Rick Davis is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, and I wonder what's going through your mind here, Rick, having run a presidential campaign and worked for several others, how you would handle this, knowing the incumbent is holding forth right around the same time in a news conference with Volodymyr Zelensky, of all people. How would you work this when it comes to optics, choreography, and the way you want it to play on the news later?
Yeah, being in Washington is a two-edged sword for Donald Trump. He is the insurgent. He, talks about being against Washington, and now he's going to be seen all around the world, as you described, but more importantly in the 6 or 7 targeted states for this general election, hanging around a bunch of politicians all day. And whether they're the House Republicans or the Senate Republicans, these are the most unpopular politicians in America. Congressional approvals are now down to about 13%. That's probably family members and staffers make up that group. And so it's not the greatest look. That being said, he kind of has an obligation to show up and take control of the party that he is now the standard bearer of. Being the nominee of the party puts him in charge of the politics of the party. And that's really what this represents more than anything else, is the landing of his nomination, and the formality of meeting with leaders of the party. And yet I would say if he had a choice, he'd probably rather be at a G7 meeting looking presidential and not getting embroiled in, every little skirmish that's happening on Capitol Hill.
So it's as simple as that. And Rick Davis reminding us, if you're with us on YouTube, that it is Seersucker Thursday in the nation's capital. As always, bringing some class to the joint. Rick, I'll tell you, I wonder how many, I want to count on how many seersuckers were in that meeting with Donald Trump at the Capitol Hill Club earlier. As we add the voice of Brad Howard, he's back with us, Democratic strategist and founder of the Corcoran Street Group. Brad, what's your thought? It sounds like advantage Joe Biden if we go into split screen mode next hour with Donald Trump in town here with the Republican leadership, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Joe Biden with Volodymyr Zelensky in Italy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a reminder of the foreign policy credentials that President Biden brought to the campaign initially, as 8 years as vice president and numerous years in the Senate as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I thought he did a tremendous job in France around the anniversary of D-Day. And keep in mind, you split screen that with Donald Trump's presidency when he wouldn't go give a speech because it was raining and he didn't want to get wet. You had Joe Biden out there honoring the greatest generation, probably the last time those folks will be there to gather with that many folks alive who were there in D-Day. And so, that combined with him showcasing the American presidency on the world stage is always a good optic to have. And, just a reminder of the chaos that is the House Republican majority, the party of Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, and that's where Donald Trump is today. So, yes, I agree. I think it's a solid day for President Biden. I think it's been a solid week for President Biden. You've seen the economic numbers go down, start to improve, inflation coming down, all in all, and Biden's poll numbers started slowly going up, not to mention 34 convictions for Donald Trump, felony convictions. So, all things being equal, I would certainly be President Biden right now rather than Donald Trump.
With all of that said, Mike Allen squashes together some polling in a note from Axios this morning with the state of play showing a significant shift toward Donald Trump from the country's youngest voters. Look at New York Times Siena polling of likely voters. Biden has a 2-point lead over Trump. Recent Quinnipiac survey, Trump ahead by a point among registered voters between 18 and 34. CNN exit polling showed Joe Biden did win the 18 to 29-year-old vote by quite a bit in 2020, 24 percentage points. Hillary Clinton won it by 19 points in 2016. Young people are said to be a huge problem for Joe Biden, Rick Davis, but you always remind us that it's pretty tough to get young people out to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, on top of all those numbers, the underlying number is, almost 40% of the 18 to 29-year-olds in that 2020 contest that Biden did so well in chose not to vote. And you have even more this time telling pollsters that they're less likely to vote. It's really kind of a part of an overall realignment that's going on in America. The driver behind these 18 to 29-year-olds is still education. If you don't have a college education, you're much more likely to be a Trump supporter regardless of your age. That includes young people 18 to 29. The big economic numbers between Trump and Biden, who can best manage the economy, is the second most important driver. Young people think that the economy was better under Trump than it's been under Biden. The Biden White House has not sold the youth of America that he can provide an economy that they can flourish in. And I must admit, I mean, I think Trump's doing quite a few backflips, but he's in policy, but he's putting together some agenda items for young people that he's never done before. If anything, he's been on the other side of the equation. So it's game on for the youth vote. There are more people, 18 to 29-year-olds, saying that they'll vote for a Republican president since Ronald Reagan. This is a big switch, and it follows some of the other realignment that's going on with white working class voters.
So, Brad, what's the view from Corcoran Street Group on this? Does Joe Biden need young people, 18 to 34, to win this election?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think keep in mind that young voters don't, unlike a lot of Donald Trump's other supporters, young voters typically don't vote with kind of a cult-like personality. Young voters are driven to the polls by issues. It takes a while for a young voter to become a loyal follower of an individual, unless you have the charisma of a Barack Obama or, or of a Ronald Reagan. And neither of these candidates have that kind of charisma. Neither of these candidates are connecting on an emotional, kind of inspirational level that draws young people to the polls. And so with that being held, with that being true, what is driving voters to the poll are issues. And issue after issue after issue, it is President Biden that's on the right side of the issue for young people. When you look at choice, when you look at climate change, when you look at gun safety, these are the issues that are driving young people to the polls. Yes, he's got some work to do with the economy, but we're starting to see those numbers to improve. But everything from student loan debt to what's going to be impacting this generation 20, 30 years from now, Joe Biden is on the right side of these issues. And I think at the end of the day, when folks are going to see, I think the biggest hurdle right now for Joe Biden among young voters is the Israel issue. And I think that's why you see Anthony Blinken working so hard, traveling around, bouncing around the globe at the moment to try to pass the USA's ceasefire deal. If he can get that done before the Democratic convention, that will reduce a lot of headaches for Democrats heading into November.
Well, we got some ripples in the water here today from the Supreme Court, and I'd love to ask you both about how this factors in to the campaign as the court preserves full access to mifepristone. This broke just a few hours ago here. And I think the conventional wisdom is, okay, pretty good for Donald Trump today because he doesn't now have to answer to this being struck down. Does it remove a cudgel of some sort for Joe Biden? Rick, how are you seeing this ruling?
I don't know. I mean, if you just look at it politically, Biden would have been better off if the Supreme Court had done today what they did during Dobbs and take away women's access to reproductive care. That obviously helped galvanize Democratic voters that, frankly, aren't galvanized today around Joe Biden in 2022, and really help fuel success in an off-year election. That being said, I mean, certainly a success for Democrats today. They had a unanimous vote at the Supreme Court to allow this, and yet I think that sort of diminishes the issue as a turnout issue for Democrats. So it's a plus on the issue and a negative on the politics, from the way I look at it.
Yeah, this could have been a huge motivator, another motivator, Brad, for progressive Democrats. What does today's ruling mean?
Let me back up a little bit, and my Republican friend Rick here using the past tense in regards to Democratic motivations around abortion. I think if you talk to any woman in this country, the idea that they would just simply forget about this issue in a year is a little insulting. Women are fired up on this issue. Women understand what's at stake in this election, and the motivation has remained among women voters about who is going to protect their rights, their access to reproductive health, their access to make their own decisions about their own body free from government intervention, and that's Joe Biden and the Democrats. The Republicans are all over the place on this issue, and in fact, according to Donald Trump's own stance on the federal issue, supports states that want to go super restrictive, as did Arizona. Now, Arizona has since changed the law, but if the state wants to go extremely restrictive on abortion, revert to pre-Civil War standards, by all means, President Trump supports that. So I think that's the issue that's going to keep galvanizing Democrats. Yes, I mean, yes, a little boost to that would have been nice, but at what cost? I mean, I think women in this country would hate the fact that we would be talking about how great politically this would have been, if not to restrict more of their rights. And so I think this issue is a bad one for Republicans. I think anytime we're talking about it, it's bad for Donald Trump and the Republicans, just simply because of the dogs that caught the car. They don't know what to do with this issue, and they really can't. Their base fundamentally, morally believes it is murder in any circumstance. And how can you craft compromised policy if that's your position? And so I don't blame them for the troubles they have. It's just that's the position of their base. In order to win elections, you have to compromise and appeal to a broad base, and that's a very difficult issue to compromise on. So I don't think they're going to fix this anytime soon.
Yeah, we're certainly not done hearing about it as we spend time with our panel, Rick Davis and Brad Howard. And a little update here from Donald Trump's travels in Washington. Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons is following him around town today. We'll talk to her coming up at the top of our second hour. But Donald Trump has begun speaking to Republican senators now at the NRSC, the National Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee that's right next to the Capitol. So he's made his way from the business roundtable to this next meeting with Republican senators. And look at who's in the room. Mitt Romney, who had, remember this flight, he had to get out of town at 2 o'clock flight. Guess what? The plane to Palm Beach was canceled. And so Mitt is in the room, the senator from Utah, with the president, along with most of the Republican caucus in the Senate. We'll catch up with Kayleigh again, as I mentioned, in our second hour, and we'll reassemble our panel. Rick and Brad stay with us on this important day that will culminate with a split screen, a news conference from Joe Biden at the G7, a speech from Donald Trump here in Washington. This is Bloomberg.
politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The split screen is in effect. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as President Biden and Donald Trump schedule competing news conferences for this hour. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We're going to have a live update coming up from Kaylee Lyons, who is following Donald Trump today in Washington, and from Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern, who is traveling with the president in Italy. All this on the day the Supreme Court ruled to uphold access to the abortion pill. We'll have much more on that with our political panel this hour, and it's all after a look at Wall Street. Let's start right now in the markets, as always, with Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Indeed, lots of moving parts in Washington, certainly as well. In U.S. markets today, we are looking at a down day for the most part for the U.S. stock market. The lone bright spot right now is the NASDAQ 100 index, up 0.3%. U.S. stocks, though, for the most part, lower across the board. Right now, we've got NASDAQ. We'll call that unchanged on the day. The S&P down 7 now, drop there of 0.1%. The Dow tumbling 203 points, a drop there of 0.5%. S&P, by the way, retreating from yesterday's record. Treasury yields fell as a cool down in another key measure of inflation this morning. Reinforced the case for the Fed to cut rates this year. 10-year, 4.24%. The 2-year yield, 4.68%. Gold down 1.1%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.1%, 78.57 a barrel. Keeping an eye on Tesla shares, up now by 3.5%. Elon Musk says shareholders have voted by wide margins in favor of reapproving his compensation package. Also, Ford shares, keeping an eye on Ford, down right now by 1.2%. Ford will sell its lineup of EVs through all 2,800 of its American dealers in a bid to boost sales of battery-powered models now being shunned by mainstream buyers. Again, Ford lower now by 1.3%. Tesla up 3.5%. Again, recapping, NASDAQ just turning higher now, up by 5 points. S&P down 5, drop there of 0.1%. Certainly lots going on in Washington. Back we go. Balance of Power continues. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
From Washington to Italy, Charlie, you said it. Thank you and welcome to the Thursday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where Donald Trump is addressing Republican senators right now. We're going to have an update in just a moment from Kaylee Lyons, who is following Donald Trump today on his return to the Capitol for the first time since the January 6th riots. In Italy, meantime, Joe Biden preparing to hold a bilateral news conference later on this hour with Volodymyr Zelensky. These two events, as Donald Trump prepares to speak as well, could collide later on this hour, drawing the literal split screen for us here today on the campaign trail. We want to start in Italy right now at the G7 with Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern, who has been traveling with the president, and it's great to have you with us, Anne-Marie. Important news today on a development that will bring more funding, some $50 billion in help for Ukraine through a new loan syndicate. How's this all going to work?
Yeah, that's right, Joe. The United States has been pushing to try to get this done for months, and finally they were able to get it over the finish line at this G7 Leaders Summit. They're basically front-loading these interest payments that have been accruing and will in the future accrue for these Russian frozen assets, $280 billion worth that are sitting in Europe. Now, the Europeans were game to basically send what was collecting interest this year, say $3 to $6 billion. But the United States didn't think that was enough. So what they're doing is they're taking the future payments up front and sending this loan to Ukraine. Now, some technical details still need to be worked out after the G7, but this is certainly a political win for the administration and also for Ukraine. When I last spoke to the Ukrainian foreign minister in Davos, he said 2024, the main goal is the financial help Ukraine needs and tapping the value of those Russian assets. He said the political will needs to be there, and once the politicians make a decision, then the lawyers and the bankers can get to work. So when President Biden steps up today, Volodymyr Zelensky, he's going to want to tout this deal as well as the bilateral security agreement that the two leaders will sign.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. We'll be hearing from the president, if all things stay on time, from both presidents in about 45 minutes. Anne-Marie, you're going to have domestic reporters there from the U.S., from the White House press corps, who want to ask about a Supreme Court ruling today on mifepristone, who want to ask Joe Biden about a potential ceasefire in Israel. The message from the White House today, though, the administration, is squarely about Ukraine. What will be Joe Biden's message on some of these other issues from overseas?
Well, he's certainly going to want to talk about Ukraine because he's going to be standing next to Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky. And the United States has been talking about the fact that they think the G7 is now more unified than ever in modern times. it's interesting you would say that, given the fact that most of these leaders, besides Giorgia Meloni, are coming here with immense amount of political pressure at home. Rishi Sunak, Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz, just to name a few. When it comes to the Mifepristone ruling on the Supreme Court, we did get a statement from the president talking about the fact, really pivoting the fact that they're so happy that the Supreme Court upheld women's access to mifepristone. But Joe, they squarely are pointing this to November, saying that more needs to be done to protect women's health care. And we're going to hear probably the same message from the president again this evening. I'm sure he's going to be asked that question when he's faced with a number of domestic reporters in the room.
That's got to be true. Anne-Marie Hordurin among them. Great to see you, Anne-Marie. Thank you for joining us from Bari, Italy, as she follows the president at this important summit. Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lyons, meantime, is making her way around the Capitol here following Donald Trump at a series of events that included a speech to the Business Roundtable a short time ago, 90 CEOs in the rooms with some pretty bold names, Jamie Dimon, Tim Cook among them. Kayleigh, what was the message from the former president?
Well, one CEO leaving this meeting, Joe, as they're all getting just shuffled into their SUVs and not really feeling open to speaking with press, just described this meeting as informative. He said it was about 45 minutes of Donald Trump addressing those in the room. But of course, we do know that there were some heavy hitters there, including the CEOs of a number of the largest banks in the country, technology executives as well. And the message is likely to be pretty similar to what Donald Trump was preaching in his meeting with House Republicans earlier today, when he was talking about what he wants to do to help with inflation and unleash the U.S. economy. In large part, that seems to be deregulating it in terms of industries like energy, and then also maybe higher tariffs on adversaries in particular, and potentially using the proceeds from those higher tariffs to lower income taxes for Americans. I spoke with Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia about what exactly Trump said about tariffs and taxes and how they could interplay together, and this is what she told me.
President Trump said he's floating an idea, and I think it's a wonderful idea. You know, our tax code is expiring this year, and depending on which party controls the House of Representatives will determine Americans and how much they pay in taxes. President Trump said, this is an idea, but I'd love to raise tariffs, and then he said maybe even no income taxes for Americans. Everyone was clapping in the room. I think that's a fantastic idea, and he even later joked and he said, if you guys are going to go vote on something today, vote to lower taxes on Americans.
Now, that was the take from Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. I did speak as well with Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York, who seemed to have a bit of a different take on how exactly Trump presented that idea in the room. She said that he didn't think he was, he said he wasn't presenting that as serious policy that he was outlining, but he did speak about the prospect of higher tariffs on adversaries and potentially that being used as a pay for lower taxes. It's just not clear that he actually said that it would mean no income tax at all, Joe.
Well, this is really interesting, Kayleigh. We sat here yesterday, you and I, with Kevin Brady, the former chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, now former congressman, who is leaning into this with the group that he's working for now, to try to start the argument now about making the Trump tax cuts permanent. They're not waiting to find out who wins this election. What did the folks in the room have to say, if anything, about that? Because they also heard from Jeff Zients, the White House chief of staff today, speaking on behalf of Joe Biden.
Yeah, interesting, of course, that Joe Biden is preoccupied in Italy, where Anne-Marie Hordurin was joining from just moments ago. Therefore, his chief of staff had to speak on his behalf. But it is, in some sense, a bit of conflicting messaging, because obviously the corporate tax cuts that were put into place under Donald Trump in 2017 aren't necessarily supported at large by Democrats, who think those lower taxes just resulted in higher profits being kept by those companies, whereas Donald Trump is really pitching easier regulation, lower taxes across the board. That seems to be the idea. On the idea of 2017 tax cuts, though, and potentially those being reinstated, when I was speaking with Congresswoman Malliotakis earlier, she said he didn't really talk about that specifically, more so just building upon the success he had in terms of lowering taxes in his first administration. It seems as though this is a conversation that has gotten started, but likely still needs to have a lot of details hammered out. It seemed by and large the meetings that Trump had this morning, at least with the House, were much more overarching than they were getting into the very specific nitty-gritty of policy. And of course, getting any of this policy actually implemented, Joe, will likely require Republicans keeping a hold of the House of Representatives, which a lot of people were talking a big game about, leaving the meeting this morning, but we know is far from guaranteed.
That's the sticky part, isn't it? Kaylee, great to see you. Thanks so much for being with us in your travels around the District of Columbia today, from the Wharf, then back to Capitol Hill, where Donald Trump is next addressing Republican senators. And we'll have more from the former president later this hour. He's at the NRSC, the National Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee, and will hold a news conference, or at least deliver remarks, to be more exact, from there. About 20 minutes from now is the schedule. We'll see how on time things stay, along with Joe Biden as well. 15 minutes later, set to hold forth in his news conference from the G7. The idea of extending or making permanent, though, the Trump tax cuts from 2017 is something that's already being debated, as we've made clear here. And Maya McGinnis has some thoughts about this. The president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the group has been crunching numbers on this to understand better what the impact would be. Kaylee's talking about offsets. Let's talk to Maya about this. It's great to see you, as always, Maya, on Bloomberg TV and radio. Let's say they get this done. Donald Trump wins the presidency and he manages to get this through Congress. Making permanent the 2017 tax cuts would do what to our deficit?
Yeah, so it would absolutely explode an already untenable fiscal situation. So just to take stock of where we are already on track to borrow another $20 trillion over the next decade. We are going to be hitting record levels of debt as a share of the economy in just a few years. Interest payments are growing faster than anything in the budget. They are the single largest item in the budget. The fiscal situation is really bad. Part of what got there, obviously some of what got there was emergencies like COVID, where we should have borrowed. But a big component was that a lot of policies have not been offset in recent years. One of those big ones was the Trump tax cuts. They added $2 trillion to the debt. Many members of Congress were saying, we made a mistake. We should have, and these are the Republicans who supported that, we should have also cut spending. We didn't do that in order to keep this from adding to the debt. But now, if you are talking about really extending these tax cuts, again, the portions that are expiring, we are talking about even larger a price tag, upwards of $4 trillion. And then there are other things they are talking about, including some of the business tax cuts that have expired, could bring you up to $5 trillion. There is absolutely no space in our very dangerous fiscal situation right now to be talking about adding trillions more. And so you just can't talk about this without thinking about how you're going to offset those costs and that lost revenue.
Well, this is really interesting, and this is something that people need to hear, because the argument, Maya, is the tax cuts aren't the problem, the spending is. And we simply need to rein in spending or somehow refigure entitlements like Social Security and Medicare to get through this. But you and I both know that's not about to happen, and neither of the men who are on the verge of becoming president, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, say they're going to touch the entitlements.
I mean, that's right. I have no problem with the argument. One could be for big government or small government, and they can be fiscally responsible or fiscally reckless, either way. But it is absolutely correct to say that our spending is growing at a massive clip. We're going to have huge amounts of growth in healthcare, retirement, and interest over the coming decades. Defense spending is also likely to increase because there are many more threats around the world. The problem is the people making those arguments then turn around and vote for spending increases. And if you look at what happened under President Trump's tenure, he cut taxes, but he raised spending massively. Every time they increased the debt ceiling, whereas most recently the debt ceiling had a package that helped to reduce borrowing, every time under President Trump, they actually added more spending to the overall budget and more borrowing. So you can't talk about the importance of cutting spending while you're casting votes to increase spending, just like most of the people who've taken a no new tax pledge also at the same time have voted to increase spending. About 90% of them have. So the hypocrisy in budget, run large, run on all sides, but it's really what's gotten us into this mess of huge, huge mountains of debt and more to come if we don't make changes.
Well, how important is this to the people who are in the room at the Business Roundtable today, Maya? You interact with a lot of them. You know, you don't hear a lot about deficits and debt in a campaign cycle when everybody's trying to grab the brass ring here. And you know there's going to be a big drive to increase Pentagon spending if there's another Trump presidency. And that'll probably happen under a Biden second term if there is one here. So What do the executives in that room think about this? Are they as worried as you are?
So my experience with the business leaders is they are very worried about the national debt, but they probably, many of them will put having tax cuts over the concerns about the debt. So we've seen that, in the past, CEOs were some of the best advocates for getting our fiscal situation under control, but I think they actually got frustrated because Washington was unable to implement those changes. And so they've turned their attention more towards the tax regime, the regulatory regime. I think they would support, and I'm generalizing, they all have different points of view. Many of them would support those spending cuts that go along with tax cuts. But again, as we've just said, there seems to be no political appetite for that. And the problem is we now have two people running for president competing on giveaways. Who can give more in tax cuts and to which group, and who can increase spending more, and who can protect Social Security and Medicare, which, by the way, are heading towards insolvency. Protecting them means across the board cuts in those programs for recipients and providers. That is a terrible promise to today's seniors and people who will depend on the programs. And yet that's what our politicians are promising. There's very little talk of fiscal responsibility. And I'm sure any CEO who somebody asked, do you think the debt should be lower than it is? They would say yes, because there's no way you can look at this trajectory and think that things are okay. We are in grave, grave danger of weakening our economy and our national security if we don't find a way to bring our borrowing trajectory down.
We're speaking some hard truths here with Maya McGinnis from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Spent the day yesterday, Maya, talking about inflation, and everyone cheered this CPI showing prices going up at a slower rate than some expected, still rising. However, depending on the metric you look at here, the Federal Reserve is higher for longer. What is the impact of ballooning deficits on this very thing, the issue that's driving voters in November, the issue of inflation?
That's right. So inflation is having a huge impact on how people feel about the economy. Clearly, we got to this inflationary moment for a number of factors: supply chains, oil, and one of those factors was excessive fiscal stimulus. At the end of COVID, we put more money in the economy than we should have, and that kicked off inflation. It's turned out that it's been difficult to get control of. The problem that politicians, all of whom want to help alleviate inflation, that they don't recognize is that all the borrowing they're engaging in now makes inflation worse, not better. If you want to help inflation, you need to bring your borrowing down so you are not overstimulating the economy. And you don't hear a lot of talk connecting those two, because again, right now, this is a political moment of promises of things to give away. We are so far removed from talking about hard truths in the budget. We don't even pass budgets. So we don't even think about what these trade-offs are. But it's really politically dangerous. There's so much pandering and demagoguing, and no one out there saying, here's what we've got to do. We've got to reduce our spending. We've got to raise our revenues. We have to reform our entitlements. Those are all critical if we are going to get out from under this mountain of debt.
Well, that's why we speak the hard truths here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Maybe they should have had Maya in the room today. How would that go at the Business Roundtable? Maya McGinnis, always a pleasure. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is Bloomberg.
121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Producer prices surprise with the biggest decline since October. U.S. stocks trading flat right now. Treasury yields fall as data keeps Fed bets alive. S&P down 0.5 point, virtually flat on the day, retreating from a record. Dow Industrials down 141 now, decline there of 0.4%. NASDAQ, though, building on yesterday's gains. Tech keeps on going. We've got NASDAQ up by another 0.1%. NASDAQ 100 index up by 0.4%. 10-year yield, 4.23%, with a 2-year that's now yielding 4.67%. Spot gold is right now trading down 0.9%. West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 0.5%. China's car makers outsold their American counterparts for the first time ever last year, a testament to the shifting power dynamics in the global auto market. That, according to researcher Jato Dynamics. Today, we're looking at Ford shares. They are lower by 1%. General Motors down 2.2%. And Stellantis, it is down by 3.2%. Again, recapping, stocks, little change now with the S&P down by 0.5 point. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. And once again, your host, here he is on a very busy day, Joe Matthew.
Ah, yes, they all are, Charlie. That's why we're here on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to see you. Thank you for joining us on the fastest show in politics. As we wait to hear from the former president and the current president, both set to speak within the next hour here, as we'll bring you remarks from Joe Biden at the G7 in Italy and from former President Donald Trump here in Washington today, making his big return to the U.S. Capitol since the January 6th attack on the Capitol, meeting with not only Republican lawmakers but business leaders. As we heard from Kayleigh Lyons a short time ago, the Business Roundtable here in Washington, it was a who's who of corporate America as Donald Trump talked about his economic agenda, the idea of tariffs, and of course, unifying the party today in Washington. That's what he's up to right now, talking to Republican senators at the NRSC. That's going to be the venue for his remarks when he speaks a bit later on this hour. Everybody showed up. Mitch McConnell, as we told you, in the room. Even Mitt Romney in the room after his flight got canceled. He's there for Donald Trump. Senator Bill Cassidy showing up there. Dan Newhouse on the other side of the hill showing up. Interesting as we assemble our panel. Rick Davis is with us, Bloomberg politics contributor, of course, Republican strategist, along with Democratic strategist Brad Howard from Corcoran Street. Rick, you see Mitch McConnell, Mitt Romney, both in the room. And it brings us back to the idea that the transformation is complete here in Washington. Donald Trump in control of the Republican Party, and this is the biggest sign we've seen yet, isn't it?
Yeah, as you described, unity is the theme of the day. That means everybody has to show up. Too bad for Mitt and his canceled flight. But, you know, look, it's going to be interesting because even though all these people have now served with Donald Trump when he was president, and most of them were in the Senate at the time, you know, they're going to see, you know, slightly different version of him. Nobody's been really paying that much attention to him. You know, there's been a busy legislative year. And so this is the day where the Republicans will, you know, basically genuflect and line up behind Donald Trump. And a lot of them who are on the ballot this year, all the House members and some of the Senate members, are going to be distinctly influenced by his campaigns in their states. And so this is really an important time. And we'll see just whether or not Donald Trump uses it to talk about grievances or talk about unity.
That's right. We were talking to Maya McGinnis a short time ago, Brad, about Donald Trump's address to the Business Roundtable. We should note that was not a Donald Trump campaign event. Jeff Zients, the White House Chief of Staff, spoke on behalf of Joe Biden to that same group of people as the president is traveling today. But the idea of making permanent the Trump tax cuts, as was discussed in that room, the idea of raising tariffs, both of which could be a major challenge to our economy, as Maya just mentioned, ballooning deficits and potentially adding to inflation. Do the CEOs in that room care?
I would hope so, because I think, as Maya would point out, an out-of-control skyrocketing national debt leads to a more unstable economy. And when you have a situation of rising debts, she pointed out the largest expense of the federal government right now is interest payments on the debt. That's not a good long-term fiscal sustainable path. I think every business will tell you when your debt grows to that extent, it's a precarious position for a business and it's a precarious position for a government. And look, Maya McGinnis, I was a senior staffer to House Democrats when she was in the room warning them about out-of-control spending and what they were proposing. She is a consistent voice on these concerns and a powerful one at that. And thankfully, we have someone like that out there raising these concerns. There was even a moment where we had the opportunity this past Congress to implement a bipartisan fiscal commission to look at the debt as a whole and not just these one-offs. Because we have shown if you leave it to politicians, they'll take the easy road every time and give out free stuff rather than make the hard decisions of bringing down the government. But I think Democrats are going to welcome this debate over taxes. We believe that the Trump tax plan benefited the wealthy and the elite and not the average working voter or the average working American. And so I think Democrats are excited about this debate over taxes because polling shows that Americans think that the wealthy in this country are not paying their fair share, and the Trump tax cuts just rewarded that. So we called it the Trump tax scheme for a reason. And as you saw, it led to higher deficits and higher national debt, just all around bad news for the economy.
Well, it's interesting. Rick, Maya went further to say it's both parties here promising giveaways and nobody promising to restrain spending, certainly not to reform entitlements. When do we care about debt and deficits again? After the election?
Yeah, where are those deficit hawks that we used to see roaming the Senate and the House of Representatives, reminding that this is, bad for our long-term health of the economy? And look, I mean, it is a political issue. If you poll it, voters care. They know what it's like to go into too much debt and get pinched. And so it does translate into issues that voters care a lot about. The question is, who's on the other side? As Maya points out, when you got profligate spending in both Republican and Democratic administrations, it doesn't really create a contrast. And so maybe by 2028, we'll see the deficit debate because it's only going to get worse based on what these two candidates are saying they're going to do. Cutting taxes, raising tariffs. Tariffs are nothing but a tax on the American people. I don't know how you pay for tax cuts by raising tariffs when you're just raising the price of goods that people have to buy. I think the concept here is to get rid of inflation, not make it worse. And yet I don't see that being translated into political speak at all.
I would like to fully agree with everything Rick just said.
Yeah, well, here we did it again with Republicans and Democrats agreeing on balance of power. No one's going to watch this thing if you guys keep at it.
Card.
That's right. You're both fired. Now, look at the statement from Nancy Pelosi today, Brad. Thinking about Donald Trump's return to the Capitol for the first time since January 6th. Quote, today the instigator of an insurrection is returning to the scene of the crime. The January 6th was a crime against the Capitol that saw Nazi and Confederate flags flying under the dome that Lincoln built. It was a crime, she said, against the Constitution. As we now bring you a live view of the podium at the NRSC from which Donald Trump will be addressing the nation here any time now. He was scheduled to begin at this very moment. How important, Brad, will it be for Democrats to remind people of January 6th in what's going to be another day here in Washington that attempts to normalize what happened?
Well, look, I was chief of staff to Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, who served on the select committee to investigate the attack on the Capitol. I don't think it's important to remind Americans just ahead of an election. I think it's important to remind Americans in perpetuity of what happened that day so that we don't ever have it happen again. The Lincoln, when the Capitol dome was being built, it wasn't just a matter of we need to finish this to have as capital. It was that when no one thought the country would carry on, that we were so divided that we would forever be two different nations. He thought it was important for the work on the dome of the Capitol to continue so that Americans felt that there was a future, that there was a country, and he thought the work being done on the Capitol means that the Union would hold. And so I think Pelosi is right. He did instigate an insurrection here. Not only did they fly flags of failed nations on the Capitol grounds, that they defecated on it, they vandalized it, they broke stuff, they stole documents and computers. They essentially raided the Capitol building. And I think it's critical to look, when folks look back on what happened that day, that they realize how wrong that was. And, you know, yes, it's a good political maneuver to remind folks that Trump ultimately led that, but we got to reflect on what it means as Americans, that a good chunk of people that believe they're patriotic Americans did that. And I think that's the psychological analyzation that we've got to work together to analyze and to prevent from happening again, in that your patriotism is not stewed in violence, that your patriotism is stewed in optimism and hope for the future.
Well, I appreciate that, Brad. What's going through your mind right now, Rick? Because we know how you feel about the events of January 6th. We're going to hear from Donald Trump here in a moment after the Republican caucus in the House sang happy birthday to him. He got a standing ovation from Republicans in every room he walked into today. They presented him with the game-winning ball from the congressional baseball game last evening. There was a time when we didn't think Donald Trump would ever be allowed back in Washington. How do you rationalize this evolution from January 6th to today?
Yeah, I mean, it fueled in amnesia by party leaders. We've, talked a lot over the years about how Kevin McCarthy swung the, screen door wide open for Donald Trump to walk back in after being pilloried by Republican leadership after January 6th. And look at how it turned out for Kevin McCarthy. You can't feed this beast enough to quench its hunger for power. And I think that today we're, sort of getting back on that slippery slope where we're celebrating party leadership that puts their own power and interests ahead of the nation's interests. And I think that's disappointing. Again, I'm an optimist. I see this as a momentary crisis in confidence in our leadership. And we'll see what happens after that. But we got an election to run, and this is all part of the choreography of that. And everything is being set aside today. Differences in policy, differences in politics, differences in character, to basically focus singularly on November's election.
Well, this is an important moment. Our reporters who are following Donald Trump letting us know that senators are leaving without saying much. A lot of rushing senators who don't have a lot of time to answer questions from reporters. And if you're with us on Bloomberg TV, you can see some of those senators, including Rick Scott, said to be potentially considered here as a member of a Trump administration. He's also running for the leadership post in the Senate to replace Mitch McConnell. Markwayne Mullin, an ally of Donald Trump, standing by as well. So I think we can assume the optics here, Brad, will not only include the 4 American flags behind the podium, but lawmakers who are going to stand with Donald Trump in a show of unity today. How will this exercise play nationally?
Well, I mean, certainly you're in that moment of where the primary is done. Donald Trump still has a problem with GOP primary voters. I think even when Nikki Haley's not running, she's still getting 15 to 20% in some of these primaries. And so he has a problem with the kind of moderate, what I call the country club Republican, Chamber of Commerce Republican crowd. He hasn't won them over yet. And so he has some work to do, and this is certainly going to help in that effort. I anticipate at the end of the day, they will come around and he'll rally his base. And I think that's why you're seeing his poll numbers go up slightly, is because he's in the rallying the base effect right now. Democrats, we have a lot of work to do on our end too, particularly when it relates to the Israel-Palestinian conflict and that the impact that's having on younger voters and black voters in particular. We're monitoring and working to win the votes over as well. I think they are a group of people that want folks to earn their support and not just expect it, and that's what President Biden is doing. I think you saw a big Juneteenth celebration at the White House on Monday. That shows exactly how he's trying to do a lot of that. And so, you're going to see a moment here where both camps are trying to rally their base around their candidate. They've got to do that ahead of the conventions, and then when you hit conventions, you 180 to the moderates, very, very tiny slither. What is it, 6% of 6 swing states that they've got to win in order to win the election. And so I think you'll see a pivot in the middle, and I hope to start seeing some forward-looking plans and proposals from both candidates when we hit that moment.
Other members now of the Senate have joined the group at the podium, including John Barrasso. Senate leadership falling in behind Donald Trump here, Rick Davis. This is the Senate, of course, that you spent many years working in with John McCain, and many of these same lawmakers coming around to support Donald Trump today. One of them is not Rand Paul, who said to Bloomberg News as he walked out of the former president's address at the NRSC to Republican senators, there are still libertarian-leaning folks like myself who want some more assurances, saying that he is still undecided on whether to support Donald Trump. He would be the outlier in this Senate, Rick. Correct?
Yeah, Rand Paul is the most unhappy man in America all the time. He's never in agreement with his caucus and rarely in agreement with anybody else in the Senate. But, you know, this does harken back to a moment in 2008 when John McCain got the nomination. He wasn't, you know, the enthusiastic first choice in the United States Senate. His colleagues had a strained relationship with him, Mitch McConnell especially. Had always a tumultuous relationship with John on issues of campaign finance reform and things like that. But they all gather around to, you know, give praise to the new leader of the party. And it does have a impact on voters. You know, voters see this as a positive. If there was any questions amongst Donald Trump's base as to whether or not he could govern, you know, with a majority in the Congress or with his own party in Congress, I think this is part of the messaging that's going to go out. Yes, they will do his bidding. They will be his partner. They will take up his agenda, and they'll try and get it through. So this is as much a message to Congress's voters as it is to Donald Trump's voters. But the idea is close ranks. Only together can we win. And I think that's more truth than not. And that's what we're seeing play out today.
Rick Scott, John Barrasso, Mark Wayne Mullen. I see Josh Hawley, other members. Looks like almost half the Senate is now behind the podium waiting for Donald Trump after his meeting with Republican senators. That followed a meeting with Republican House members, and today also included Donald Trump's address to the Business Roundtable here in Washington, D.C. Brad Howard, recalling your experiences not only on January 6th, but your experience working for former Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy on the January 6th committee. What do these optics mean to you as you watch these senators gather to hear these remarks?
I mean, it's mixed emotions. You expect it as the head of the presumptive nominee of one major political party coming to the Hill. That's certainly something that a lot of them do. Probably every one of them have done. But it also hurts to see him glorified in such a way when I had so many friends who were still struggling with some elements of PTSD from that day, when you saw how embarrassing that moment was on the world stage to see Americans believing through what they believe is patriotism destroying the world symbol for democracy. I think that really kind of hurts a little bit. I think anyone who was affected that day, either emotionally or professionally, this is a hard scene to look at. I mean, you expect it. You've come to realize this was going to happen. It'll be even harder if he's sworn in on those steps that same day next year. So, I think it's just, I think would have appreciated a acknowledgement and a reminder, acknowledgement of what happened that day from someone on the Republican side of the aisle, because they were just as affected as we were, just as scared for their lives, I think, as a lot of my friends were on the Democratic side. That I think as we move forward, it's kind of hard to heal from these moments when you have two different realities, interpretations of that day. One, which is accurate because we all saw it with our own eyes that day, and two, the other one, which has been spun to be some kind of tame event that it wasn't. And so, there's still folks that are healing, still folks that have promise and hope in America, and we'll move through these moments just like we have all the others that have threatened American democracy.
More senators are making their way to the podium where Donald Trump will be speaking any moment now. We'll bring you his remarks live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. John Cornyn, Senator Cornyn, who, of course, is running for the leadership post here to replace Mitch McConnell. Rick Davis just speaking on his way out of the meeting with Donald Trump. He says the leadership fight, the choice of McConnell's successor did not come up at this meeting. He called it encouraging and very uplifting the session today with Donald Trump. Rick, will Donald Trump choose, if he wins re-election, the next Senate leader?
He might. There's going to be, obviously, right now there's a three-way race. And you would assume that at some point, if Donald Trump is elected, the period between the November elections and the election for leader, whether it's minority leader or majority leader, will take place. And I can't imagine a scenario where he wouldn't weigh in. And it may not be one of the three that are currently running. There's been some speculation that if they win the majority in the Senate, someone like Rick. Steve, the committee chairman, for the campaign, would be a potential.
Let's listen, Rick, as Donald Trump makes his way to the podium. He just got a big round of applause. This is live sound from the NRSC here in Washington, D.C., the former president, live on Bloomberg.
Money not wasted all over the world. We don't want to see Russian ships right off the coast of Florida, which is what they are right now. That's unthinkable. We want to see just success for our country. And we don't have success right now. We have inflation that's killing everybody. We have levels of inflation that nobody's seen for, they say 42 years, they say 53 years, and they say 75 years. I would say probably all of them are wrong. Probably we've never seen levels like this before. And we're going to end that. We're going to bring back our jobs. We're going to bring back common sense to government. We're going to have strong borders, and we're going to have people come into our country, but they're going to come in legally. They're not going to pour in from prisons all over South America and all over the world. And it's not just South America, by the way. It's all over the world. And we're not going to have them pour in from mental institutions, which is where they're coming from, large numbers, and large numbers are terrorists. And we're not going to have this. So what's happening to our country is of great concern to the group of people standing alongside of me. And I just wanted to say that we have great unity. We have great common sense. A lot of very smart people in this room, and a lot of people that love our country. They love our country beyond just about all else. And the only thing that maybe supersedes it is their family and maybe their faith in certain instances, and that's very nice. But they want this country to be great again, and we're going to make it great again. And so I just want to thank the Republican Senate, and I want to thank also the House. We met, as you know, with the full House, Republican House today, and we had a tremendous meeting with them also, and there's great unity. Very similar, different topics actually, but not that different. And there's one thing in common. We want to make America great again. We want to make our country great again. We're a nation that's in decline. We're a declining nation. We're a nation that is being laughed at all over the world. We have a leader that's being laughed at all over the world. And we're going to turn it around. We're going to turn it around fast. The polls are looking like they're very strongly for us. And no matter where you look, in fact, a lot of states that people thought weren't in play are very strongly in play. Some were actually leading in. But we have to get elected. We have to take this beautiful place, and we have to make it really something very special again. Right now, it's not special. Right now, it's being scorned and being used as an example of when they look at the crime on the streets, when they look at all of the problems that we have, they're using us as a bad example of democracy. And they're getting away with murder, and we're not going to let it happen. So I just want to thank you for coming, and I want to thank everybody here. You're all either elected or you're going to be elected again and reelected, and I'm with every one of you, and you know that. I'll be with you always. And thank you very much for inviting me, and we're going to have great success. I think we're going to have a tremendous election. It's November 5th is very important, but we really start much earlier than that. You have North Carolina as an example. You have North Carolina September 6th. You have Pennsylvania starts on September 22nd. These are things different from the old days. We had election day and you had paper ballots and you had voter ID. Unfortunately, maybe someday we'll get back to that, but you don't have that right now. But this is an outstanding group of people. I'm with them 1,000%. They're with me 1,000%. We agree just about on everything, and if there isn't, we work it out. And I've had a really great relationship with just about everybody here, and just about all of the senators. And if it wasn't fantastic, it gets worked out. And we have one thing in mind, and that's making our country great. So thank you all very much. We appreciate you being here. Thank you very much.
Donald Trump speaking from the NRSC live in Washington, D.C. Not expected to take questions. What was originally billed as a news conference, just a short set of remarks there from Donald Trump and what is his first return to the Capitol since the January 6th attack on the Capitol, speaking earlier with House Republicans who sang happy birthday to the former president. He turns 78 years old tomorrow. Then addressing the Business Roundtable, where Joe Biden was represented by the White House Chief of Staff, and now, as we see, meeting with Republican senators in a meeting that included Mitch McConnell. Some were surprised to see him attend this, as well as Mitt Romney, after his flight to Palm Beach was canceled, and no excuse to not be at the NRSC today. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for being with us on Bloomberg TV and radio as we reassemble our panel. For a quick swing on this, I want to know what Rick Davis thinks about what we just saw and heard. Bloomberg politics contributor, Republican strategist, joined today by Brad Howard, Democratic strategist, the founder of the Corcoran Street Group. Rick, there you have it. We should note some of the things that Donald Trump said, referring to the U.S. as a declining nation. He opened his remarks, as he has been typically doing recently, with criticism on the border and Joe Biden's policies. He referred to migrants coming from mental institutions and prisons, as we've heard Donald Trump say before, which is something that Bloomberg cannot confirm. But he talked about the great relationships that he has with everyone in that room. He said, just about everyone. We agree 1,000%, Rick. Was he right?
He's right for today. Everything is situational. There's no issues really being discussed. I thought, took off after inflation, the number one issue in America, at the top of his comments, and then sort of got into the MAGA speech. But you're right. I mean, even when people ask the campaign, can you justify these claims that other countries are pouring immigrants from their mental institutions and prisons into the United States, the campaign itself can't justify their claims, and other organizations like PolitiFacts have called it false. So it's just a campaign event for Donald Trump. And if you try to fact check his campaign events, you're going to go crazy. So I think today is just a reflection of his talking points, whether they're true or not.
So he's back, Brad Howard. I wonder your thoughts on what we heard today from Donald Trump on his return to Washington.
Well, look, I think what you saw was someone who's trying to be a party conciliator, trying to bring his party together and show unity in a party that has had a terrible reputation for dysfunction over the last 2 years. I mean, ousting a sitting speaker and not being able to decide who to lead the party in the House. And then, of course, you now have got a very uncertain era in the post-Mitch McConnell era, who's going to lead the Republican conference. And then you've got Donald Trump, who's been at consistent odds with the mainstream kind of D.C. inside the Beltway Republican circles since he came to power. So, I think it behooves the Republicans to show some unity here, because they've had nothing but disunity ever since Donald Trump shook the snow globe of American politics. And I think the snow is still coming down to the ground here as we now look to what was unthinkable decades ago for Republicans, the party of free trade, to come in and start supporting increased tariffs to the point where we increased tariffs so much that could potentially drive the cost of goods and products in the U.S. to dramatically new heights, leading to increased inflation and higher deficits. And that is the most anti-Republican principle I can think of in the old school kind of Republican Party. So, there's a display of unity. I don't know how long it's going to hold, and it would be interesting to see really who takes McConnell's place and if they're willing to stand up for the traditional Republican principles of free trade, free enterprise, and global dominance in the global economic marketplace.
Well, it'll be interesting to see the unity around Joe Biden as an answer to this, knowing that many progressive Democrats have been upset with the president here about his policy in Israel, among many other issues. Brad Howard and Rick Davis, thank you for staying through the remarks from Donald Trump today. A great panel and a great conversation here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, as we add the voice now of Saleha Mohsen, who is not only a seasoned reporter here in Washington, but hosts our Big Take DC podcast. It's great to see you. We should note Joe Biden is just about to hold a bilateral news conference, and if you've been waiting for him, we thought this could be a split screen. It's been delayed, and we expect it will begin around 2 o'clock Eastern time, about 10 minutes from right now. The contrast could not be greater with this incumbent and the former president we just heard from today.
There's a huge contrast, but there's also some similarities there. We have two men who have already served almost a full term for Biden and a full term for Trump, both, hitting some high numbers in terms of their age and vying for a second term. But yes, we have also just a drastic difference. Someone who is trying to persuade the American public to come back for his brand of, like our guest said, shaking up the snow globe of American politics versus someone who is just trying to say, hey, let's just calm things down, bring the temperature down, and hold on to the new status quo that we have.
Think of the difference in messaging. To your point, the president, Joe Biden, the sitting president, is going to be holding forth with Volodymyr Zelensky in a bilateral news conference from the G7 in Italy. You couldn't think of a greater contrast with the optics of what we just saw at the NRSC. Saleha, what did you make of all these Republican senators going out of their way to applaud Donald Trump and to stand behind him as he addressed Americans today? Some of those lawmakers never imagined they'd be in the same room as Donald Trump after January 6th.
It goes to show that the Republican Party will stick together and stick behind their own when it comes time to cast votes, when you have to put your money where your mouth is. And I think Democrats have so far shown that they're willing to let some of the fighting play out a little bit longer. And we'll see whether that strategy bodes well for either the Republican candidate or the Democratic candidate.
We had an important Supreme Court ruling today. I bet it's going to be a forthcoming Big Take DC podcast. Mifepristone, access to the abortion pill upheld. President's going to have to deal with answering questions about this, about a ceasefire in Israel, even as he tries to deliver a message about Ukraine and the business at hand today in this new loan program for Ukraine. That's the job of being president. He's going to have to spin all these plates during this news conference.
He is, but he needs to do that without a gaffe. Both of these candidates are prone to gaffes.
Or getting angry.
Or getting baited into something, or struggling to keep up with this shifting tone and different policies. We're going from something very much domestic policy, health related, and to Israel Hamas is international politics, and Russia assets is like international financial and economic diplomacy.
Point was made in one of the tip sheets this morning that one thing Joe Biden is not doing right now is rehearsing, preparing for a debate. This is probably the most important date on his calendar this summer, while the G7 brings the benefits of incumbency and important work that he must do as the elected leader. At what point does he get in the room and do murder boards, as we call them, in a mock debate to get ready for this?
I think the minute he lands, he probably should be focusing on that, but also I think sparring with the press, as he's going to in the next couple of days.
Is that a good warm-up?
Yeah, exactly, and chatting with his G7 counterparts. That's a good warm-up, I think.
Well, I suppose that's true. What are you looking for on takeaways here beyond the photo op? Does Joe Biden need to deliver something beyond support for Ukraine in this?
I think it's unity. We've got Europe coming apart. He can be the voice of unity.
That's perfect. The podcast drops today, partly why we talk to Saleha Mosin every week at this time. The Big Take DC. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. I'll meet you back here for the late edition at 5 p.m. Washington time, only on Bloomberg.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, live on Bloomberg Television, Radio, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. This is Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Carol Masser along with Tim Stenevec. And let's get to the setup on what is turning out to be a pretty busy Thursday on this June 14th, 13th. 13th.
Yeah, 13th.
How did I do that?
Thursday the 13th.
I was thinking, it's not Flag
Friday
Day
the 14th
yet.
Tomorrow.
It's
Yeah, I know where your
not.
head is, Carol.
Although politics kind of front and center, so we've seen a lot of flags, U.S. and others today. We're going to get into that in just a moment. We did also have, Tim, another inflation print.
Yeah, that makes the case for a Fed rate cut this year. And so yields moving down, 10-year breaking below 4.3%. Treasuries rallying after that strong $22 billion sale of 30-year bonds. We're going to have more on the markets in just a minute.
Yeah, kind of interesting. We're seeing some of the market moves here, so we're going to get into that in just a moment. As I said, busy hour ahead. As the expected U.S. presidential candidates, we've seen them kind of go head-to-head today. I heard Joe Matthews saying, I thought we were going to have a split screen of Donald Trump on one side and Joe Biden on the other. That hasn't quite happened. We've heard from Donald Trump because he has been meeting with some of the best-known names on Wall Street, corporate America. So we're going to get kind of the postmortem on that. And then we are still awaiting President Biden at the G7.
Plus, a question that we've been having as we've seen some Fed-friendly data come in is, what's it like for small businesses out there? How are they really doing right now? We're going to be joined by Frank Sorrentino over at Connect One Bank. He's the CEO there. He's going to give us some information about what they're seeing when it comes to their lending environment and what he's hearing from the CEOs of these small businesses that he works with each day.
He's been pretty robust and upbeat, if you will, over the past year or so. Also, we're going to get into the commodity markets. Deadliest metal that is booming. This is one of our most read stories on the Bloomberg today.
And one more thing. Did you even know that this was a thing, Carol?
What?
These programs that simulate keyboard activity?
What?
Yeah.
Wait,
Makes
you
it look
mean-
like you're working when you're not really working.
Don't get any ideas,
Yeah,
anybody.
it's our one more thing among the most read on the Bloomberg terminal
Because
today.
you might get caught. All right, we're going to get into that in just a moment. First up, though, quick check on the trade and your top business stories. Here is Charlie Powell.
Hi, thank you very much. Here's what's going on. Right to the numbers. We've got a decidedly mixed market right now on this Thursday. PPI Thursday with the Dow down 127 right now, lower by 0.3%. S&P little change, struggling for direction. It's been swinging between gains and losses. Right now, higher by 1 point, little change there, up less than 0.1%. Nasdaq up 26, up by about 0.2%. 10-year 4.24% with a 2-year that's now yielding 4.69%. Gold now down $23 the ounce to $23.01, drop there of 1%. West Texas Intermediate crude just about flat on the day, $78.47 a barrel. Broadcom, after earnings, a chip supplier for Apple and other big tech companies, seeing its biggest surge in 4 years. Shares of Broadcom today up now by 12.4%, also announcing that 10-for-1 stock split after NVIDIA. And after the bell today, we will be hearing from Adobe. Adobe shares are lower now by just about 0.2%. Briefly, Netflix has announced a live hot dog eating competition featuring Joey Chestnut that will be broadcast on Labor Day. Chestnut will be competing against competitive eater rival Takara Kobayashi. Netflix shares today, they are trading higher by 0.4%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. So you might have seen the headlines or heard about them earlier. BlackRock Global Infrastructure Partners, Brookfield Asset Management, pledging $4 billion as part of the Group of Seven's effort on infrastructure spending and investing, paired with the private sector specifically. BlackRock's Larry Fink was speaking, Tim, at that G7 meeting.
As for G7 leaders who are there, many face political struggles back at home amid the rise in populism that we've seen around the globe and difficult domestic environments. That includes U.S. President Joe Biden, who, Carol, it's safe to say, had a pretty rough week.
Yeah, safe to say. We head to Italy, where we find Bloomberg Surveillance co-host Anne-Marie Horton. Anne-Marie, great to have you here. Already a long day for everyone involved, including you. What's been the big development so far, and what's kind of the mood on the ground?
Well, the big development was what happened this morning, and the president's obviously going to tout that as he prepares to take the podium next to Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. And this was the fact that the U.S. was able to get the G7 to sign off on something that they've been trying to for months, and that was to tap the Russian frozen, these immobilized at the moment assets that are sitting in Europe, $280 billion worth. What the U.S. wants to do, different from what the Europeans were doing, is that they want to tap the future interest on these securities, that money that may accrue over the forthcoming years. They want to tap it right now and front load that money to Ukraine. So they'll be sending $50 billion worth of U.S. dollars approximately to Ukraine through a loan. So the president is going to tout this clearly today. And one key issue, of course, is the fact that, as you mentioned, a lot of these leaders are coming here that are dealing with mounting pressures back at home, besides one, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. So for them to coalesce around this, they're almost election-proofing this financing to Ukraine, because Ukraine would get it before the end of the year. So regardless of what elections may be taking place in which countries and what leaders may be showing up and not showing up that are here today to next year's G7, they are going to be getting this money to Ukraine as soon as possible.
It's so interesting that you talk about this idea of election proofing, because here in the U.S. there's been pushback, especially on the right, over U.S. support of Ukraine. Are we seeing similarly that around the world with the rise of populism in some of these European countries, Anne-Marie?
We are in some of these countries. I would note that after the European parliamentary election, specifically in Germany, we saw the AfD have a very good evening. It was a huge blow to Olaf Scholz and his coalition. And what we saw happen this week was when Zelensky went to Germany and he spoke to the Bundestag, some members of the AfD, as well as also some members of far-left parties, these lawmakers decided to protest and not show up for Zelensky's speech. In some of the co-founders of the AfD's caucus, they're talking about the fact that they want a not a wartime president of Ukraine, they want a peacetime president of the Ukraine. At one point, someone called him a war beggar. So you can see there are some of these concerns brewing in some of these nationalistic far right and some lawmakers far left about their concerns about sending more aid and money to Ukraine, which is why this G7 is trying to show a unified front. But obviously, these discussions have been clouded by what they are dealing with back home.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you, Anne-Marie. You have traveled the world. You have followed these meetings over the years. I am curious how distracted it seems the G7 leaders, the teams of these G7 leaders, considering what they are facing on a domestic front. How united are they? So how distracted do they seem to be? How united do they seem to be?
So around the table, they seem united on what they wanted to try to accomplish at the G7, even though there are obviously nuances, say China, how the U.S. is dealing with 100% wall on Chinese EVs, while you just saw the EU come out after their commission's probe, looking at a little bit more of a nuanced approach. One company maybe 17.4% in terms of a tariff on Chinese EV imports, to as high as a different company 45%. But around the table, they're collectively trying to show a united front. Individually, if we just take a look at some of the three top leaders of Europe right now, Rishi Sunak comes here, potentially not going to be leader of the UK in 3 weeks' time exactly, when the British electorate goes to the polls. You have Emmanuel Macron, who was beaten down after the European parliamentary election, so he calls for a snap legislative election, and then rumors start to swirl this week that he would potentially resign if he was dealt another blow, and he had to come out before he came to Puglia to talk about the fact that he will not resign. And then Olaf Scholz, who was dealt a massive blow in the European parliamentary election and who's not doing very well, record low polling for him and his coalition. Not to mention Trudeau, who's also dealing with very low polling and a lot of rise in the conservative movement in Canada. And of course, President Joe Biden, which if you look at the polling similar to Europe when they went into these parliamentary elections and to the United States, the top issue remains the economy and inflation for all of these countries, and then other issues like immigration and migration. And that's the gap you see with what leaders are discussing around the table, and that they want to tout standing strong for Ukraine, but really what the electorate is focused on domestically.
Yeah, I feel like all these leaders, they know how to deal with stress, but I feel like they're dealing with stress on a whole other level right now, especially when it comes to kind of their home fronts. Having said that, the United States, what is the role for the U.S. in the Western world and globally? Is it a different role going forward, perhaps?
Well, President Biden came to his first G7 in Cornwall, the United Kingdom, and he said America is backed. Now, of course, since many are viewing the U.S. election as an absolute coin toss, Europe is starting to prepare for potentially what a Trump 2.0 presidency would look at. Many Europeans were caught on the back foot in Trump's first round. What unnerves them is some of the criticism Trump has pointed to when it comes to NATO, calling some countries who have not met their target delinquents. At one rally, he had talked about that he would potentially tell Russia they could do whatever hell they want with some of these countries, his words, if they didn't meet their NATO target. So that kind of rhetoric unnerves European allies, and they are preparing potentially for Trump 2.0, which is why they wanted to get the $50 billion loan to Ukraine done, as well as why Biden and Zelensky will be signing a bilateral security agreement. That will last about a decade. Now, it's not a treaty, so a future president could pull out of it. It doesn't need congressional authority, but it is a security agreement that would be more of a keystone feature, something more solid that Ukraine can hold on to, regardless of potentially who the next U.S. president is.
Anne-Marie, before we let you go and before we do hear from President Joe Biden, just give us 30 seconds on the conflict in Israel and what leaders are saying about Gaza and the conflict there.
Well, President Biden said he doesn't think there's going to be a ceasefire soon. We do know that this deal is on the table. He wants to see Hamas act. I imagine, even though the president is going to be squarely focused on Ukraine as he stands next to Volodymyr Zelensky, a lot of domestic pressure in the room, and this is a hot-button issue. The G7 would like to see that deal the president outlined at the end of May go through.
It all certainly feels very heavy. All right, Anne-Marie, thank you so much. Bloomberg Surveillance co-host Anne-Marie Hordern in southern Italy. All right, now we go closer to home where we normally find President Biden, and we're talking about Washington, D.C.
Donald Trump's brand on Wall Street, once tarnished by the U.S. Capitol attack and his bombastic political rhetoric, has made a near full recovery. It's evidenced by the lineup of bank industry chieftains attending an event earlier today with the former president. And then after that, just moments ago, we did hear from the former president at the NRSC, the National Republican Senatorial Committee on Capitol Hill. For more on that, we head to our DC News Bureau, where we find Bloomberg News senior national political correspondent Nancy Cook. Nancy, the names on this list: JP Morgan Chase's Jamie Dimon, Citigroup's Jane Fraser, Brian Moynihan of Bank of America, Tim Cook of Apple. Who was there? How long was the meeting? What went down? What do we know?
So Trump spoke to the Business Roundtable. They have a quarterly meeting, and they invited both former President Trump and President Biden. President Biden is in Italy, as you were just talking about, so he sent his Chief of Staff, Jeff Zients, and then Trump came. They both spoke this morning. The conversation with Trump was really a fireside chat with his former National Economic Director, Larry Kudlow. It was very friendly and did not make news, but the big thing was that he basically spoke in front of 100 CEOs, some of whom you've already mentioned, also the heads of Cisco, American Express, NASDAQ. You know, there were a ton of real powerful CEOs in the room. And, you know, this is pretty key for Trump as he tries to really line up a bunch of support from Wall Street and the business community, both politically, but also to help fund his campaign.
Nancy, just the visual, we have it up right now, looking at the event earlier, you know, and in terms of Trump, you know, meeting, just the visual significance of, or just knowing that former President Donald Trump is meeting with the likes of someone like Jamie Dimon, who, as you know, if there's a story, Jamie does something or says something, it's among the most read on the Bloomberg. We're going to talk about it a lot. These are a who's who of Wall Street, the business sector, the visual significance that is happening. Should we read this as investors, as individuals, as voters, that this is just business as usual? I mean, the business community will meet with all political candidates.
They are, but I think it's a real recognition. You know, the business community and Wall Street really turned away from Trump following January 6th and that attempted insurrection. And I think a number of Wall Street people in particular were flirting with backing other candidates during the Republican primary, like Nikki Haley or Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. You know, Trump really swept those early contests in New Hampshire, Iowa, Nevada, South Carolina, and really solidified his support very quickly among Republican primary voters. And I think establishment, Wall Street, business community people are really now just seeing, well, he's going to be the nominee. They have questions about Biden's record, and a bunch of them are back to backing Trump, or they're at least like open to it because they feel like there's a 50-50 shot that he could be president, and they don't want to be caught out in the cold if he is.
And to be fair, my understanding is White House Chief of Staff saw and spoke to the group earlier in the day, right? Obviously, Joe Biden couldn't because he's at the G7, but my understanding is that the White House also saw or met with the Business Council as well.
I said that already. He spoke at 9 a.m. Jeff Zients, the White House Chief of Staff, talked early in the morning. You know, President Biden was invited, but obviously he's in Italy at the G7, and last week was in France. So he's had his own really packed schedule. And so both men were invited, and but it was just a really key chance for Trump to appear before a bunch of CEOs. And they have the Trump campaign has been very eager to sort of put him in the position of sort of meeting with CEOs and visually looking like he has the backing of CEOs, the oil and gas industry. You know, he's increasingly getting some support from Silicon Valley, and they're very eager to showcase that.
How would you, Nancy, explain I don't really want to call it a reversal yet, because it's not like we've seen widespread embracing of the former president at this point, but I think it does speak volumes that so many of these folks who did denounce what happened on January 6th end up in the same room as him a little earlier today. Not to mention the folks who have come out and said, yes, we didn't support him post-January 6th, but we are fully on board with the former president right now. How would you explain that reversal?
Well, I think two things are happening. One, I think that in the Republican Party, there has been a wholesale rewriting of what happened on January 6th. And it's been something that's been really interesting to watch as a reporter. I think that Republican primary voters were the first people to sort of rewrite what happened. But I'm hearing from, wealthy Republicans, donors, folks on Wall Street, that what happened on January 6th was not that bad. It was not an attempted insurrection. It was more like a mob. These are people that are really, trying to cast what happened on the Capitol and people trying to overturn the election as a whole different thing, just to justify their support for, the former president. And then secondly, I think that there's a bunch of people in the business community who feel like the Biden White House has not done a sufficient job of reaching out to them. They want lower taxes. They want less regulation. And even though privately they may still have some reservations about Trump, they're willing to give him a second chance just because they feel disenchanted with Biden. And I think that's that's where the business community is at this point, or a lot of people are.
Well, the race is on, right? Now we're focusing on a lot of fundraising efforts. That's to come, right? Next, Nancy, and that we'll be watching quickly, in the future, and that'll give us an idea of kind of how things are laying out in terms of the money that starts to come in on both sides.
That's right. We're expecting the next Federal Election Commission reports to come out a week from today. I can tell you that since Trump's conviction in New York in the hush money trial, he was found guilty on 34 counts, including falsifying business records. The campaign has raised $15 million, and it will be interesting to see next week if he has closed that fundraising gap with President Biden, who does have his own deep well of support in Hollywood, in tech, on Wall Street, but the money race is also getting tighter.
All right, absolutely. All right, great stuff. Thank you so much. We know a busy day for you, but really appreciate that we could check in with you on this. A lot going on, obviously, in the nation's capital. Nancy Cook, she's senior national political correspondent at Bloomberg News. She's joining us again from our Washington, D.C. bureau on a day where we've seen, once again, yields backing off a little bit. Another weaker, if you will, inflation print, PPI, coming out earlier this morning. And you've got kind of a mixed market, slightly higher on the S&P, call it little change, unchanged almost, and the NASDAQ just up about a half a percentage point.
Yeah, S&P 500 up 0.1%, a little bit of green right there. As you mentioned, the Dow down 0.2%. Hey, coming up in just a few minutes, the commodity market's deadliest metal that's booming. The Bloomberg Big Take is straight ahead.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The world's biggest bond market climbed after a $22 billion sale of treasuries saw strong demand, adding fuel to a rally driven by bets that the Fed will cut rates this year amid signs of disinflation. Stocks are trading mixed. The Dow lower now, down 0.2%. S&P advancing, trading at a record right now, up 5, up 0.1%. NASDAQ also trading higher, up another 42 points, up 0.2%. Any advance today for both the S&P and the NASDAQ will be a new high. 10-year, 4.24%. That 2-year, 4.69%. We've got spot gold down 1%, 23.01 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude right now unchanged, 78.50 for a barrel of WTI. Tesla shares are gaining. We've got Tesla shares up now by just about 4%. Tesla higher after Elon Musk said shareholders voted by wide margins in favor of reapproving his compensation package and moving the company's state of incorporation to Texas. Ford, meanwhile, will sell its lineup of electric vehicles through all 2,800 of its American dealers in a bid to boost sales of battery-powered models now being shunned by mainstream buyers. Ford shares today down 1.3%. Again, recapping, looking at a mixed market on this Thursday here. S&P up 6, up 0.1%. Adobe, by the way, and RH after the close of trading. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Well, today's Bloomberg Big Take is on the uranium fever that is underway and how the commodity market's deadliest metal is booming. With radioactive metals price, uranium, it is up about 230% over the past 5 years. That's more than triple the gains in gold and copper, even after declining a bit in 2024. Tim and I, like, what we love about this story, it's just Bloomberg at its best. Takes you to a part of the world you probably don't know about, but you should.
With more on this most read story on the Bloomberg today, we welcome Bloomberg News equities reporter Jeffrey Morgan in our Toronto bureau. You can read Jeffrey's story and more from Bloomberg The Big Take on Bloomberg.com and at Bloomberg.com. The Big Take. Welcome, Jeffrey. We talked recently with Will Wade about the recent huge party down in Georgia to celebrate the first new reactors in more than 30 years in the U.S. You get into this so-called rebirth that's happening, not necessarily here in the U.S. yet, but certainly around the world. And a lot has changed in just a few years when it comes to the way people think about nuclear power. Give us an idea.
Yeah, so the change in attitudes towards nuclear power has been quite dramatic in the last few years. And we saw this kind of at the COP climate conference at the end of 2023, where there were 23 countries that agreed to triple their use of nuclear power. And so this brings up the question of, well, where are they going to get all of their fuel for these nuclear power plants from? And this is what took us to the extreme northern reaches of Saskatchewan, which is home to kind of the most prolific basin of uranium in the world. Since the 1940s, it has produced more uranium than anywhere else. It's currently not the largest producer, but if all of the mines that have been proposed there are built as planned, it will retake its place as kind of the top of the charts from Kazakhstan, which is currently the largest producer in the world. And this is a place that really has a lot, it's got a lot of projects that are being considered, a lot of exploration, but it's a very difficult place to get to.
Well, take us there and the difficulty you had in actually getting there, if you would.
It was a bit of a harrowing journey. It took us 2 attempts. You have 2 options to get there. You can drive 9 hours down a small gravel road from the nearest city, or you can try to take a helicopter about an hour from an airport on the Alberta side of the border in Fort McMurray. And if you're doing this in April through a snowstorm, it's a bit of a harrowing journey. We emerged unscathed, and we enjoyed being able to see what will be. This is going to be the world's largest uranium mine if it is built as planned. But the part of this story is that this journey, while it was difficult, is in a remote place. In the world of uranium, it's actually maybe one of the more accessible locations. Kazakhstan, for example, which, as I said, is the world's largest producer right now, they had been shipping all of their uranium through Russia to the port of St. Petersburg. Now there's sanctions in place on Russia, and they've got to find a new way to get their uranium to market. So it's going out the Trans-Caspian route. Niger, a country in Africa, West Africa, there was a coup there last year, and now there's problems with that country getting its uranium out. So by comparison, yeah, we had a very difficult journey getting there. And in fact, I lost my lunch. I didn't lose my head during the trip, but it was.
You're here talking to us. You
ride.
survived.
Well, what is it? What does it feel like, Jeff, to pick up a small black radioactive bar of uranium with your hands?
So wear gloves, and we had a bit of a comparison. So it's interesting. What's interesting about this location is it's so dense. We pick up, first of all, they hand us a small gray bar, which has a low concentration of uranium, about the size of a phone, and it weighs about as much as a phone would. Then they hand us this black bar, and it is thick. They say it's about 60% uranium, which is an order of magnitude larger than most other places. And this feels like a 15-pound dumbbell. It's, again, just the size of a phone. But it is heavy. If they hadn't warned us, we probably, I'm not expecting something that small to weigh that much. It's a surprisingly heavy chunk of rock. And that is really why this area has kind of taken off and why there's so much more interest from major investors in New York and Australia and Hong Kong in investing in this area, because the resource is just so dense, and really, I wasn't really prepared for something that small to weigh that much.
Given that it's highly radioactive, how is it mined? What's the process? How do people get it out of the earth?
So this is an underground mine, and in this case, they're going into the bedrock. So the rock is hard. There are a couple ways to mine it. In this case, they're chipping away at the rock with face protection, ventilation, etc. There are a few stages in terms of getting a uranium ore out of the ground and then to a nuclear power plant. It needs to be milled, then it needs to be converted, it needs to be enriched. And in this case, the uranium is so densely packed that it actually needs to be diluted before it's sent to an enrichment facility or a conversion facility. So this is the way that it's being done in this part of northern Saskatchewan. In Kazakhstan, it's being kind of leached out of the ground with they call it an in situ method. So they're using a series of pumps to kind of leach this out of the ground. They're using acid to pull it from the rock.
Right.
But this is this is a typical mine.
Hey, Jeffrey, one thing I want to get into, and you get into in your story, is that this mania for uranium has spilled over into the stock market, and you talk about traders bidding up shares of uranium companies. Many of the miners in Canada have soared more than 400% over the past 4 years. And yet you also remind us that we're kind of always just one bad accident, nuclear accident, away from kind of everybody pulling back again.
So and that is what happened with this sector, back in 2011 with Fukushima. And some of the uranium ETFs that are out there that had existed pre-Fukushima haven't actually regained their previous pre-Fukushima levels. Even though we have this mania, even though companies like Cameco have been some of the top performers in Canada over the last couple of years. And you have this company, which we visited this mine site, NextGen. This is going to be a site that produces about 13% of the world's uranium. This is a pre-revenue mining company with a $4 billion US valuation, which is kind of unheard of. You don't really have these types of pre-revenue unicorn companies in the mining space. That's kind of something you see in the tech space a little bit more. And so it is unusual, but it speaks to this kind of the supply deficit that's coming for this commodity.
Jeffrey, how much uranium is needed to power a reactor?
That does depend a little bit on the size of the reactor. So the U.S. Nuclear demand overall is about 50 million pounds a year.
Okay.
And the U.S. production is less than 1 million pounds. So this is a huge source that needs to be imported. Old mines that had been mothballed because the price of the commodity had fallen so far that miners just mothballed their projects for a few years. Those are being reopened, so the U.S. production will rise. But in this case, this mine that we visited will produce 30 million pounds a year. So that is, over half of the U.S. demand. It's a shocking amount that could come out of this mine.
So one thing I wonder too, and I think about, going up to the Balkans in North Dakota in the fracking craze, and I just remember sitting at a little diner and the folks are like, we're so kind of negative and subdued. The locals are like, we've seen this energy rush before. I know you're all excited and this is, but we've seen it before. How much or how soon before this kind of supply-demand gap that we see currently that's pushed up these prices for the commodity and the companies that play in this space, how long before that gets kind of more in balance?
So the outlook right now, because it takes so long to build a uranium mine and because it takes so long to build a nuclear reactor, the outlook is that this supply-demand balance will kind of close at about the year 2030, which is roughly when this mine that we visited will open, but then it will really widen again. This is from the World Nuclear Association. It's also from a few forecasting outfits, including one called TradeTech, which is based out of Denver. This could reach about 100 million pounds a year through the 2030s. So what we have here is we have countries that have been building nuclear reactors, especially in China, also in India, a few others, Egypt, Turkey. But the supply response has not really happened yet. Like I said, those mines were actually shut down and mothballed rather than being, new mines reopened. There are not a lot of mines around the world that have been permitted through this previous period where we had the bear market that lasted so long.
You didn't bring any small black radioactive bar home, I suppose.
Please no.
I'm just kidding.
I did not, no.
Listen, love this story. It's among the most read. It is the Bloomberg Big Take.
You're right. It's so Bloomberg, Carol.
It's so Bloomberg. It just, like, we've all learned something. So appreciate it. Bloomberg News equities reporter Jeffrey Morgan on today's Bloomberg Big Take.
Hey, let's get to world and national news. We got Nancy Lyons down in the D.C. newsroom for an update on world and national. Hey, Nancy.
Thanks, Tim. The Supreme Court today unanimously preserved access to a medication that was used in nearly 2/3 of all abortions in the U.S. last year. Brown University professor Wendy Schiller says the case was basically thrown out because the justices said the plaintiffs had no standing. But she says this is not likely the final word.
Republicans can breathe a sigh of relief because the Democrats cannot make this another issue on top of abortion access. But on the other hand, pro-life groups will now push Republicans on the campaign trail to say they'll do something legislatively about this rather than through the courts.
Wendy Schiller is the director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University. Donald Trump is back in Washington today. He's been talking about his agenda with lawmakers. He spoke after meeting with Senate Republicans.
We have great unity. We have great common sense. A lot of very smart people in this room and a lot of people that love our country. They love our country beyond just about all else.
Earlier in the day, he met with House Republicans and discussed with them ways they can help him in his legal cases. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. Coming up, the U.S. Open golf update brought to you by Audi. Don't let anyone else drive off in the Audi model that you've always wanted. Visit your local Audi dealer to get behind the wheel of yours today.
6:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We've got the Dow lower, the S&P, NASDAQ, both pushing higher, both at records right now. 10-year, 4.24%. The 2-year, 4.68%. S&P up 6, a gain of 0.1%. The Dow slumping 90, lower by 0.2%. NASDAQ up 45, now up by 0.2%. Again, that 10-year, 4.24%. Spot gold now trading down by $23 the ounce, $23.02. A drop right now of 1%. West Texas Intermediate crude oil down 0.1%, $78.41 a barrel. Broadcom, a chip supplier to Apple and other big tech companies, seeing its biggest surge in 4 years after its latest results topped estimates lifted by robust demand for AI products. Shares of Broadcom right now, they're up by 12.6%, also announcing that 10-for-1 stock split. After the bell today, we will be hearing from Adobe. Adobe ahead of earnings, down 0.8%. Also after the bell, RH, Restoration Hardware. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Well, you know, when we look at the markets generally, Charlie, of course, just giving us an update on this Thursday trade, but we've talked about small cap stocks. They have way underperformed large cap names this year. Little change on the year, in fact, as the S&P 500 continues to take out one record high after another, it seems. The S&P 500 now is up about 14%, Tim, year to date.
Well, with a view on small business and the lending world, we have back with us Frank Sorrentino, Chairman and CEO at Connect One Bank. It's the publicly held New Jersey-based community bank. They've got a $677 million market cap. He joins us from Long Island. Frank, good to have you back with us. That Fed decision yesterday kept rates unchanged as expected. Do you believe the Fed is behind the curve, in your view?
Well, good to be back, Tim and Carol. Thanks for having me. You said the magic words. This was very much expected. I don't think the Fed is behind the curve. I've always said that the Fed is data dependent. And I think I said a year ago on this program that the economy is robust, and it appears that that happens to be true. So I think the Fed is doing exactly what they should be doing, watching what's happening. They are seeing signs of inflation beginning to come down. However, employment is incredibly strong. Small businesses have a high degree of optimism. Business is strong in many, many segments. And so those who were predicting 3 or 4 rate cuts earlier this year, I don't know what data they were looking at to make those predictions. My prediction has been rates would stay generally where they are through this year, through the end of this year.
Well, it's interesting. And, we went back and listened to our last interview with you. I think it was back in February. And you reminded us that, listen, the year before, or in 2023, late 2023, you were giving this outlook of being robust, and you said how everybody's like, you're crazy, and you've stayed upbeat. You've confirmed it again. I mean, here we are in mid-June. Everybody's still confident, still upbeat. I mean, you work with home builders, you work with, the construction folks, the manufacturers. Everybody is in a good place.
Look, I think, again, we need to talk about it in different segments and or, different parts of the economy. But if we just want to stick with interest rates for a moment, I have been saying for the last year, and what I believe is true, is if you look at historically over the last, you pick a time frame, 10, 20, 30 years, this is not a high interest rate environment. It is a higher interest rate environment than what we came from. And so when you think about a 4.25% 10-year, and you think about even the 5.25% or so overnight rate, these are not extraordinarily high interest rates. So it is natural that businesses that came out of COVID, businesses that had supply chain interrupted, a housing shortage across this country where we just can't build enough houses or apartments, that we wouldn't have a more robust economy. All the infrastructure spending that's going into the economy, all, the climate issues, the military spending. You just think about everything that's happening at this moment in time. And to think that we'd have anything less than a robust economy, I just don't know where you would be getting that data from.
Frank, we apologize. We've got to cut it short, but for a good reason. President Biden getting ready to make some comments. So hopefully we will come back to you very, very soon. Frank Sorrentino, Chairman and CEO at Connect One Bank, joining us from Long Island, New York. We are getting ready to head back to Italy. We are expecting a bilateral news conference with President Joe Joe Biden and Ukrainian President Zelensky. Of course, as we heard from our Anne-Marie Horder earlier, that was a big part of the early sessions, if you will, at the G7 in terms of what aid and how they get the money that is needed for Ukraine.
And as we await a quick check of the markets, the Dow is down 0.2%, while the S&P 500 up 0.2%. The NASDAQ composite higher by 0.3%.
Yeah, so we'll look for some more color in terms of some of that announcement. Right, on a day, where we are coming post-Fed, a lot on the minds of investors. But to be fair, and you know it from the conversations that Tim and I have had, certainly I feel like all this year, and even at the end of last year, that geopolitics is front and center. And so the alliances that have been in existence for years, for decades, certainly in the Western world, they are stressed. There's a lot of pressure for many leaders, Western leaders, when they get to their domestic issues and their home front. And new alliances are being formed. We've seen China and Russia become much closer. And so it's an interesting time for global leaders, but in particular, some of the stress points that you're seeing on Western leaders.
I think also one thing top of mind, certainly, and we talked about this with Anne-Marie, is the rise of populism that we've seen in recent elections in Europe. Kind of mirror what's happening here in the United States and what has happened here in the United States since the 2016 election. But the way that voters in other parts of the world are reacting to what's going on in their local economies, including inflation, notes on immigration from all over the world as we do see migrants move from one country to another country, and the result of what happens in elections when voters are voting on those issues.
Yeah, absolutely. But the business of global politics and global alliances must continue. And, many have said it'll be interesting to see when we in November go to the polls. We've talked about what's top of mind for a lot of voters, and that is whether or not they feel in a better economic situation, particularly many do not because of the pressures of higher prices. But right now we do want to head to Italy, a bilateral news conference between President Joe Biden and Ukrainian President Zelensky, expected to make some comments about some of the aid that will continue to flow to Ukraine to help them in their war against Russia. For those listening on radio, the two stepping up to the podium. Let's go there. And actually, before we start to hear them speak, they're signing, obviously, some kind of agreement between the two, part of what we heard from Anne-Marie Horton earlier. So tapping into certainly monies that will continue to flow to Ukraine to help them in their fight. So again, the visual, for those who are not actually watching right now, a handshake between the two leaders as well, and now stepping up to the podium to make some comments. Looks like we will hear from both of them. Let's head back to Spain. To Italy, excuse me.
At the NATO summit in Lithuania, the United States brought together every member of the G7 to sign a joint declaration of support for Ukraine. 25 additional countries joined us quickly. Each agreed to forge a long-term bilateral commitments with Ukraine. President Zelensky and I have just now signed that agreement between the United States and Ukraine. Our goal is to strengthen Ukraine's credible defense and deterrence capabilities for the long term. A lasting peace for Ukraine must be underwritten by Ukraine's own ability to defend itself now and to deter future aggression anytime in the future. The United States is going to help ensure that Ukraine can do both, not by sending American troops to fight in Ukraine, but by providing weapons and ammunition, expanding intelligence sharing, continuing to train brave Ukrainian troops at bases in Europe and the United States, enhancing interoperability between our militaries in line with NATO standards, investing in Ukraine's defense industrial base, so in time, they can supply their own weapons and munitions, working with Ukraine's partners to build a future force that is strong, sustainable, and resilient, and supporting Ukraine's economic recovery, as well as its energy recovery, after Russia has repeatedly targeted Ukraine's energy grid with massive attacks in the futile attempt to break the will of the Ukrainian people. All these lines of efforts and others are laid out in this agreement. Additionally, the G7 achieved a significant outcome this week on the matter of Russia's frozen assets in Europe and other places outside of Russia. Back in 2022, 2 days after Russia's invasion, Members of the G7 and the European Union worked together to freeze $280 billion in Russian central bank funds outside of Russia. I'm very pleased to share that this week, the G7 signed a plan to finalize and unlock $50 billion from the proceeds of those frozen assets, to put that money to work for Ukraine. Another reminder to Putin, we're not backing down. In fact, we're standing together against this illegal aggression. The agreement that President Zelensky and I just signed also lays out our shared vision for a just peace, a peace rooted in the UN Charter and the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, a peace with a broad base of support around the world that holds Russia accountable for the damage it has done in this war. We will see this vision strongly affirmed at the historic peace conference happening in Switzerland this weekend, where Vice President Harris will represent the United States. Finally, this agreement accelerates Ukraine's integration into the European and transatlantic communities. It includes major commitments from Ukraine to implement democratic, economic, and security reforms in line with the European Union's accession goals and NATO's programs of reform. While we take this step, the United States is also intensifying pressure on Russia. Yesterday, the U.S. Treasury Department made clear any bank anywhere in the world that deals with sanctioned Russian banks, companies, or individuals risk being sanctioned themselves. And we announced roughly 300 new sanctions on individuals and companies that are helping Russia with war effort. They include key parts of Russia's financial sector. I'll wait till it goes over. As well as individuals and entities that supply Russia with items critical to its defense production, like microelectronics, machine tools, and industrial materials. We also sanction more Russian future energy projects, that Russia's natural gas oil projects that are under construction and are not yet fully operating. Putin is counting on revenues from these projects. Our sanctions will disrupt those plans. Plus, at the G7, we discussed our shared concern about countries like China, who are supplying Russia with materials they need for their war machine. And we agreed to taking collective action to push back against that activity. Let me close with this. We've taken 3 major steps at the G7 that collectively show Putin he cannot wait us out. He cannot divide us. And we'll be with Ukraine until they prevail in this war. First is the bilateral security agreement just signed. Second, historic agreement to provide $50 billion in value from Russian sovereign assets to Ukraine. And third, an agreement to ensure our sanctions efforts disrupt third countries that are supplying Russia's war efforts. That will increase pressure on the Russian economy. Collectively, this is a powerful set of actions and will create a stronger foundation for Ukraine's success. 2.5 years ago, Putin unleashed a brutal war in Ukraine. And it's been a horrifying ordeal for the Ukrainian people who are so brave and incredible. It's also been a test for the world. Would we stand with Ukraine? Would we stand for sovereignty, freedom, and against tyranny? The United States, the G7, and countries around the world have consistently answered the question by saying, yes, we will. We will say it again. Yes, again and again and again. We're going to.
Thank you so much, Mr. President Biden, dear President, dear journalists, dear Ukrainians, dear Americans, and thank you so much. Thanks, Italy and Georgia, for an invitation. Dear friends, today is a truly historic day, and we have signed the strongest agreement between Ukraine and the U.S. since our independence. And this is an agreement on security and thus on the protection of human life. This is an agreement on cooperation and thus on how our nations will become stronger. This is an agreement on steps to guarantee sustainable peace, and therefore it benefits everyone in the world, because the Russian war against Ukraine is a real global threat. I thank you very much, Mr. President, for your leadership, which is reflected in particular in this agreement. and in your years of support for Ukraine. I thank our teams, both teams. Thanks very much for making sure that the details of the agreement are really good. And of course, I want to thank every Ukrainian soldier, all our people whose courage made this level of alliance between Ukraine and the United States possible. And I'm proud of our people and what Ukraine can do, and I'm very grateful to all Americans, to everyone in America who strengthens American leadership. So, under the points of the agreement, first, the agreement contains a very detailed, legally binding part, and this means the credibility of America's support for our Ukrainian independence. Secondly, security commitments from the United States are based, among other things, on the sustainability of security and defense support, not only for the duration of this war, but also for the period of peace after the war. And we will definitely ensure peace. Third, it clearly states that America supports Ukraine's efforts to win this war. Fourth, the agreement has good provisions on weapons for our defense, whereas specifically on the Patriot systems, whereas specifically on the supply of fighter squadrons to Ukraine. That's right, plural squadrons, including but not limited to F-16s. We have worked for a long time for this. The agreement is also very specific about the supply of the necessary weapons, joint production, and strengthening of the defense industries of our countries through our cooperation. And this is something that will not only provide security, but also new, good jobs for Ukrainians and Americans. The agreement also outlines what is needed in terms of intelligence information. The agreement contains key aspects of protecting the lives of our people. Fifth, it is very important that the agreement also addresses the issue of Russia's just responsibility for this war and its attempts to destroy Ukrainians. America supports both fair compensation for the damage caused by Russian strikes and working out ways to ensure that frozen Russian assets are used to protect and rebuild Ukraine. The agreement also includes sanctions and export controls that will make Russia feel the pain for what it is doing against the freedom of peoples. And two more things. I'm grateful that the philosophy of our security agreement is, in fact, the philosophy of the alliance. And that is why the issue of NATO is covered through the text of the agreement. It states that America supports Ukraine's future membership in NATO and recognizes that our security agreement is a bridge to Ukraine's membership in NATO. It is very important for all Ukrainians and for all Europeans to know that there will be no security deficit in Europe, which tempts the aggressor to war and makes the future uncertain. Now we are clearly defining everything. We will cooperate for the sake of victory, make peace guarantees effective, and provide the necessary security for our people. And thank you, Mr. President, for your leadership in the G7's decision on $50 billion loan for Ukraine. It's a vital step forward in providing sustainable support for Ukraine in winning this war. Russian immobilized assets should be used for defending lives of Ukrainians from Russian terror and for repaying the damage aggressor caused to Ukraine. It's fair and absolutely right. Mr. President, thank you, your team. I would also like to thank the United States Congress for their support, both parties, both chambers. Thank you, and thanks to every American heart that does not betray freedom and supports us. Slava Ukraini.
Now what we'll do is we're going to take 2 questions from American reporters and a question each from 2 American reporters and a question each from 2 Ukrainian reporters. The first person I'm to call on is Colleen Long of the Associated Press.
Thanks, Mr. President. About 2 weeks ago, you changed course to allow Ukraine to fire U.S. weapons into Russia. Given the reported successes, would you consider further expanding the parameters on U.S. weapons into Russia, even despite your concerns about escalation? And on the news from home, you're going through something that so many American families go through, the intersection of addiction and the criminal justice system, but you're not like most families. Was your son able to get a fair trial? Do you believe the Justice Department operated independently of politics? And for President...
Let me answer your question and you ask his question, okay? With regard to the first question, it is clear that the near abroad, meaning just across the line of the border with Russia and Ukraine, that it makes a lot of sense for Ukraine to be able to take out or combat what is coming across that border. In terms of longer-range weapons into the interior of Russia, we have not changed our position on that sort. With regard to the question regarding the family, I'm extremely proud of my son Hunter. He has overcome an addiction. He's one of the brightest, most decent men I know, and I am satisfied that I'm not going to do anything. I said I abide by the jury decision, and I will do that, and I will not pardon him.
President Zelensky, a number of leaders here in Italy, including President Biden, are facing upcoming election challenges. How will the security agreement signed tonight and the other promises of support continue if they are not in office? And what's your contingency plan if they don't?
Thank you for this question. May I ask? First and foremost, I'd like to thank the people of the nations, first and foremost, to the United States, to the countries in Europe and on other continents who have supported us since the very beginning of this absolutely unjust war of Russia against the people of Ukraine. That is it. They've been killing people, that homes and territory, all that is very important. It is part of life, but first and foremost, we're speaking about people and lives of people. You understand? And this war was unjust since the very beginning. The war of this evil, whose name is Putin, the war against the people of Ukraine, and he has killed so many people. To say that it is not him, there was a military man who did it. The last one is just an instrument of his, and he's playing this instrument, and therefore it is important for us that since the very beginning we were supported by people, by nations, because they understood that we share common values. We simply want to live, and the people understood. They imagined what will happen if such evil attacks them, and therefore we were supported by people. And I thank President Biden and other leaders who, since the very beginning of the invasion, Putin's invasion, started to support us. They, based on their values, they were based on the voice of their people, and it is impossible without people. And I am sure that this nation chooses leaders and presidents, and it seems to me that no matter whom the nation chooses, first and foremost, it seems to me that everything depends on the unity within this or that state. And if the people are with us, any leader will be with us in this struggle for freedom.
Yeah, with pleasure. Thank you so much. Так, будь ласка, телеканал Інтер.
Yes, please, Inter. Irina Ivanova, Inter TV channel.
Both leaders
So today, during the G7 meeting, the discussion focused on developing Ukraine's air defense system based on the most advanced Western complexes and also on enhancing long-range capabilities. So my question is, can you provide any details on the initiative and about the readiness of our allies to take part in it? Thank you.
I'd be happy to respond to that. We have acquired commitment from 5 countries so far for Patriot batteries and other air defense systems, as well as we've let it be known to those countries that are expecting from us air defense systems in the future, that they're going to have to wait. Everything we have is going to go to Ukraine until their needs are met, and then we will make good on the commitments we made to other countries.
I think President Biden already answered your question. Really, he knows, and all other partners, they know that urgently we need 7 Patriot systems. Yes, to save our cities, not all of them, it's a pity, but urgently 7. And we discussed the possibility of having 5 of them. It's true, but the partners work on it. It doesn't mean that tomorrow we will have these 5 systems, but we see in the closest future good result for Ukraine.
You'll have some relatively quickly. American reporter, Josh Weingrove, Bloomberg.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have a question for President Zelensky shortly on the announcements, but if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you about your discussions on the situation in Gaza here at the summit. You were asked just a short time ago about it after the skydiving demonstration. Can you give us your assessment of Hamas's response? And do you believe that they are trying to work towards a deal, or is this response working against a deal? And what is your message to allies, including those here at the G7, about what more, if anything, the U.S. can do to drive towards a peace agreement? Thank you.
I wish you guys would play by the rules a little bit. I'm here to talk about a critical situation in Ukraine. You asked me another subject. I'll be happy to answer it in detail later. But the bottom line is that we've made an agreement. I've laid out an approach that has been endorsed by the UN Security Council, by the G7, by the Israelis, and the biggest hang-up so far is Hamas refusing to sign on, even though they have submitted something similar. Whether it now comes to fruition remains to be seen. We're going to continue to push. I don't have a final answer for you.
And to President Biden's point, a question about today's discussions. President Zelensky, the $50 billion today, you've had the supplemental, of course, from the U.S. Congress recently. Can you give us an assessment of the situation on the battlefield right now and what has been given now? How long will this get you in terms of either stopping the Russian advance or making headway on this? And how long will it last you if indeed future leaders or current leaders are unable to reach consensus on further aid packages? And President Biden, I'd welcome your assessment of the situation currently on the battlefield and what difference the supplemental has made as well, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Indeed, we were expecting the fundamental package of the support within the Congress of the United States of America, and truly it was a long pause for our warriors first and foremost, but it is important and we are grateful that in the very end we have this supplement, and this will for sure strengthen our warriors. Yes, this has given the opportunity to the enemy within this pause to try to occupy Kharkiv, but that attempt was stopped by our warriors. They were repelled. The enemy was repelled, and we, despite everything, disrupted all their plans, and it seems to me that that is the most important thing. What this supplement that will arrive gives us, it enables us to fully equip the reserves, those guys, those brigades that are ready, so that they provide for the opportunity to rotate our units on the battlefield, so that they can have some rest, so that the brigades can regenerate, so that other brigades enter the battlefield instead of them with equipment. This is what the supplement gives them. So the raise of morale, but also the raise of strength of our brigades. And it seems to me that this is the most important. For how long this will be enough? Look, we without package have been holding the lines for 8 months, and the Russians had no successes. And therefore, the question on for how long it will be enough? No, I think the question has to be for how long the unity will last. The unity in the United States together with the European leaders. How these or those elections will influence this unity. It seems to me that we should look on this exactly this way, to preserve unity, to preserve the integrity of the world, integrity of the democratic world, because if Ukraine does not withstand, the democracy of many countries will not be able to withstand, and I'm sure of that.
We had to wait till we passed the legislation overall, being held up by a small majority of our Republican colleagues. It was just terrible. And there's a lot more money coming beyond what's already come in the other tranches that are available now that we've passed the legislation. So they'll have what they need and get it there as quickly as we possibly can.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Telegram, будь ласка.
Telegraph, please.
Good evening. My name is Yaroslav Zharin of Telegraph UA. Thank you for this opportunity. I have a long way from Kiev and have enough time to prepare such long question. Firstly, to Joe Biden. Mr. President, the additional Ukraine Supplemental Appropriations Act that you signed mandated the submission of strategy war for the war in Ukraine within 45 days after its enactment. This deadline passed on June 8th, and now yet the international community has not seen this strategy. Has it been developed? And if the strategy is classified, what steps does your administration plan to take to hasten Ukraine victory in the war? It's my first question. The second will be to the President.
What was the last part of your question?
Has it been developed, this strategy, and what steps does your administration plan to take to victory Ukraine in the war?
The steps we're going to take to make sure that Ukraine has victory and that Russia does not prevail is continued support. What we just signed. We signed that, and a significant number of nations have signed it. We have convinced the G7, we've got support of the G7, and quite frankly, 48 other countries. We sat with the Prime Minister of Japan, South Korea. We have 50 nations have signed up beyond the NATO and the G7. And so we're going to stay as long as it takes. With regard to the plan, that is a plan in process now. We're discussing with our Ukrainian friends exactly what it would be. We have a lot of movement toward that. We know the outlines of it. We have not done the detail of it all. But we know what Ukraine is capable of doing when given the material to defend themselves, and that's exactly what they're doing now.
And my second question is to President Zelensky. It will be in Ukraine. And recently you have made a couple of sharp statements regarding China, and there are rumors in press regarding the possible supplies of Russia's weapons to China. Apart from that, China is actively promoting its own peace plan among certain countries. What are the motives of Beijing now, and would it be possible to change the vision of China regarding our war, and which role the U.S. can play in this? And the final question is China a partner of Russia in these crimes that it commits?
Was long. First of all, I had phone conversation with a leader of China by phone. He said that he will not sell any weapon to Russia. That is the first. We'll see with you. We'll see. But he said to me, if he is a respectable person, he will not, because he gave me the word. The second, you know very good with details our peace formula. It's very open for everybody, basing on Charter, yes, UN nation, and you know that it bases on Next principles: territorial integrity, sovereignty, nuclear security, food security. If China has alternative view on it, it can prepare alternative peace formula. If we share common views on it, like with globally with all the world, I think so. So if they share the same way to peace, we will find dialogue.
By the way, China is not supplying weapons, but the ability to produce those weapons and the technology available to do it. So it is, in fact, helping Russia. Thank you all so very much. Appreciate it.
This concludes our press conference. Thank you, everybody.
All right, everybody, you have been listening to a joint press conference with U.S. President Joe Biden with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, the two signing a 10-year security agreement coming on the heels of similar deals that Kyiv reached with countries including the UK, Germany, France, and just hours earlier, Japan. The U.S. pledging to help Ukraine win the war against Russia, with the pact opening the way for joint military exercises. However, there are requirements to reforms. Ukraine will need to step up its efforts against corruption. So there's a lot in that agreement, obviously taking questions from members of the press, the American press as well as the European press. Right now, though, we want to check in with our Joe Matthew. He's co-host of Bloomberg's Balance of Power on radio and TV. He's in D.C. Joe, a lot to unpack there. It's interesting. Tim and I were talking kind of the politics of Joe Biden at G7 supporting Ukraine, Donald Trump meeting in D.C. with business execs, meeting with Republicans, some who do not share that same support for Ukraine. Your world, what's important right now on this Thursday afternoon?
Yeah, the contrast could not be greater. We were talking about the split screen in the early edition of Balance of Power, and that's what we got here. There was a time in which we thought these two events might even collide for a literal split screen today. But you're right. This is Joe Biden holding forth at the G7 just a week after he was in Normandy, delivering this message to save democracy, trying to draw the contrast between himself and the former President Donald Trump, even as he fulfills his role as the president, the benefits of incumbency, as they say here. He was asked about using offensive weapons in Ukraine, as we're seeing the U.S. now actually allow the Ukrainians to fire U.S.-provided weapons across the border against Russia in the area of Kharkiv. He says he has no plans to widen that scope. That was news. Our own Josh Wingrove asked a couple of questions there, which is pretty remarkable considering the number of reporters who wanted a piece of these two presidents. And he pointed Joe Biden to Israel. This is the other big outstanding question right now. And the president didn't have much to add about the chances of a ceasefire right now in Israel, something that feels quite elusive now, 2 weeks after he rolled out his proposal that he said Israel was on board with, but we still don't have one.
Joe, the significance of this 10-year security agreement that the two, Joe Biden and Volodymyr Zelensky, signed here, how much of this is about ensuring that there is support for Ukraine's effort against Russia if there is turnover in the White House or in other European countries?
It's a great question. I'm sure this is obviously something that they had Donald Trump in mind for, but Joe Biden wants to have a second term here to continue actively funding the war effort in Ukraine. It's difficult to say. Donald Trump could change a lot of things if he's elected as well, we need to remember. But the idea that we would get together with our G7 allies and talk about ways to further support the effort in Ukraine, this is $50 billion they're unlocking through this loan program, essentially. And the conversation next will turn to how to access frozen Russian assets, the bulk of which are held in Europe. And the United States doesn't have a lot of opportunity to unlock that money without a protracted legal process, which is something that could last for years. So when you hear people talk about, cashing in the super yachts and frozen Russian assets in Europe. That's more about rebuilding Ukraine, not so much paying for the war.
Really good, important distinction to make there. Joe, thank you so much. Joe Matthew, co-host of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. More BOP at 5 p.m. Wall Street time, so be sure to check it out.
Hey, let's get on over to Charlie Pellet to give us an update on the trading day top business stories. About 40 minutes until the close. Hey, Charlie.
Indeed, Tim. Right now we're looking at a mixed market day after the Fed decision. S&P trading higher. Could see another record today at 54.33. A gain right now of 0.2%, up 12 points. We've got the Dow lower by 0.1%, while NASDAQ pushing higher as well. Could see a record there, up by about 0.4%. 10-year right now 4.24% with a 2-year yielding 4.68%. World's biggest bond market climbed after a $22 billion sale of treasuries saw strong demand. Spot gold is falling 0.9%, holding above 2,300, 23.03 on the precious metal, while West Texas Intermediate crude is down 0.2%, 78.37 for a barrel of WTI. Broadcom, after earnings and announcing a 10-for-1 split, up 12.4%. After the close of trading, we will be hearing from Adobe. Adobe right now down by 0.1%. Recapping a mixed equity market right now with the Dow lower, S&P up 13, up 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. You are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week on what has turned out to be a rather busy Thursday, certainly here around the world and certainly out of D.C. Having said that, we did have some economic news that we kind of wanted to get into that we think is pretty important because we've seen treasuries react once again. We had an auction as well. PPI, though, unexpectedly declining the most in 7 months. So let's get to it with Molly Smith. She's Bloomberg News economics editor. She joins us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. Day 2. And we have a second inflation print that comes in softer than forecast.
Yeah, the rally continues. I mean, look, a lot of this has been driven by energy prices, at least today in the PPI report. That was really evident between gasoline and diesel fuel, driving a lot of the declines. But you did see a bit more broadening out of disinflation, which is exactly what the Fed wants to see, because what they had seen to date of the disinflation progress we've had has not really been broad. So I think we're starting to get more into those service categories that have been so relentless up until now, that we're finally starting to get a broadening disinflation trend. Really saw that in the CPI yesterday, especially because services were really what drove most of the trend there, and goods prices were flat. Not quite as the same mix in the PPI today, but certainly those categories that the Fed looks at that feed into their PCE report, which is the one that they prefer to look at, those came in pretty tame.
We talk about this $30 billion, this treasury auction for 30-year bonds, and it was a good one. And I don't know, is that also play into this expectation that maybe investors are thinking, okay, we're starting to top out when it comes to rates? And is that why, or how do you read it?
I mean, I'm looking at it more in the sense of like what's going on with the data personally, but of course you can't just single that out. There are so many things going on. I mean, as we just saw the G7 meeting right now, there's so many, occasions that are tradable events right now happening simultaneously. So of course, auctions very much being one of those. But at least as it relates to the economic data, these have all been moving in the one direction that is very Fed-friendly, to see inflation easing between the CPI and PPI reports, and also the increase in unemployment claims that we saw today, also to see some more loosening in the job market, also Fed-friendly in that way. Of course, not American-friendly, but what the Fed wants to see.
Right. But still, I'm having trouble shaking this idea that the jobs market, the labor market, is still hot, given the jobs number that we saw in terms of change in non-farm payrolls coming in almost 100,000 above estimates.
Right.
We got that number on Friday. That seems to be the one data point, Molly, that doesn't belong with all the other data you brought up.
It's so challenging, and this is something that I was hoping Powell might try to square a bit better for us yesterday, but he admitted as well that it is really tough to reconcile all of this different labor data that's really pointing in a lot of different directions right now. So I think at the moment it's really about taking signal from whatever indicators maybe fit your narrative the most.
Right.
A little bit of a, I don't want to say cherry picking, but maybe like to whatever fits that agenda that you're trying to, really believe in right now and set policy based upon. Because like you said, the establishment survey is saying one thing, but then the household survey in that same report is saying something else, as are a range of other labor market indicators.
Well, traders in the Treasury trade certainly banking on a lower rate environment, at least right now. You've got a 10-year note at 4.24, so we've definitely seen a dip.
Big move.
When it comes to, right? Really big move. All right, Molly, thank you so much. Appreciate you hanging around as we went through a lot of news. Molly Smith, Bloomberg News economics editor here in studio.
Okay, so Treasury's rallying a little bit. Also, we're rallying Tesla shares today after Elon Musk posted that shareholders voted by wide margins in favor of reapproving his $56 billion comp package and moving the company's state of incorporation to Texas. That shareholder meeting kicking off at 4:30 Wall Street time today. Ahead of that, we've got a great roundtable to talk all things Elon. Max Chafkin, Bloomberg Businessweek columnist and contributor to the Elon Inc. podcast. Jeff Feely, Bloomberg News legal reporter. Max here with us in New York. Jeff joining us from Wilmington, Delaware, which is actually where I want to start, Jeff, because you're in Delaware, and that's kind of the main theme with the votes today. What's at stake from a voting perspective at the annual meeting, legally?
Well, not much, to tell you the truth. The voting stuff today is mostly symbolic. The two questions that are up for decision are, one, should Tesla move its legal incorporation, its home of incorporation, to Texas, away from Delaware? And two, should Mr. Musk's voided pay package that was once worth $56 billion and the largest to any executive in history should be reinstated? I'm sure you guys remember that a judge in January wiped it out over conflicts of interest on Tesla's board. So those are the two things that are at issue. The problem is that the votes have virtually nothing to do with the current pay case that's pending in Delaware. Their results could be taken into effect by the judge who's still got the case for finalization, and the Delaware Supreme Court when it comes to an appeal. But neither one of them have to. It's not binding. The vote's not binding.
All right, Max, come in on this. I mean, the gyrations of everything in the world of Elon, right? It just always keeps us on our toes. What's the significance of this and how it all went down?
Yeah,
so
I mean,
far?
Jeff's right, because ultimately, this is still a legal case. What's significant, though, is that, in some way, right, Elon Musk still has the support of his shareholders, which was at question to some extent.
Retail and institutional? Or?
Well, I mean, we don't know yet, and we don't know exactly how this vote is going to break down. We've seen, Bloomberg's reporting on sort of where the institutional investors are breaking down. It's been a mix, right? Some institutional investors are backing these pay packages, some are not. It seems like the retail investors, as we kind of expected, assuming the information that Tesla has started putting out last night is correct, are overwhelmingly backing this, which shouldn't come as a huge surprise, because after all, Tesla is worth way more than its peers in terms of its revenue, right? These are many. If you're buying Tesla at its current price, you are betting on Elon Musk. So it'd be hard to imagine a bunch of Tesla investors, voting against what Musk wants. On the other hand, he has been courting controversy. He's been acting in a way that I think critics have seen as distracted. There are numerous lawsuits. There's a whole swirl of reasons why investors might be more skeptical than they were, and it looks like Musk is going to have at least a win. Now, this is not necessarily a legal win, more like a PR win, but